Section 1. The Yellow Skin Problem. There is a detail so obvious, so completely visible in every single frame of every single episode across 36 seasons, that the fact we stopped seeing it tells you something profound about how the human mind adapts to the world it lives in. Every person in Springfield is yellow, not slightly tinted, not pale in a way that could be explained by indoor living or bad lighting, a deep, saturated, unambiguous yellow that exists nowhere in the natural range of human skin tone. The Simpsons family, the neighbors, the teachers, the police officers, the doctors, the congregation at the church, the customers at the diner, the strangers walking past in the background. Every person who grew up in this town, every person who spent their life inside the borders of Springfield, carries the same impossible coloring in their skin. And we watched it for 36 years and told ourselves it was just a cartoon style. Here is what makes that explanation quietly extraordinary. The show has always drawn a clear visual distinction between the people of Springfield and the people who arrive from somewhere else. Guest characters, people visiting the town, celebrities making appearances, government officials passing through, they have always been drawn with noticeably different proportions, more natural eye shapes, more realistic facial geometry, skin that reads as human rather than as a color field from a Pantone swatch. The people inside Springfield look one way, the people outside Springfield look another, and the boundary between those two groups maps almost exactly onto the boundary of the town itself. Most people who encounter this observation for the first time reach for the same explanation. It is an artistic choice. Matt Groening designed the characters to be immediately recognizable in a peripheral glance, so he chose a color that no real person has, meaning that if you saw even a fraction of a Simpson character in the corner of your eye, you would know immediately what you were looking at. This is true. Groening has said this. It is a documented part of the show's visual design philosophy. But the show's own universe does not know that. Inside Springfield, the characters are not aware they are animated. They are not aware they were designed by an artist who needed quick peripheral recognition. They wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and they see what they see, and what they see has never prompted a single question. That is the part that rewards attention. The yellow skin is treated, within the internal logic of Springfield, as completely unremarkable. Nobody has ever looked at their own hand and wondered why it is the color of a legal notepad. Nobody has ever visited a doctor and had the doctor say, during an otherwise ordinary checkup, that the skin pigmentation of everyone in this zip code was worth investigating. No child has ever come home from school and asked their parents why the kids in the television programs do not look like the people in their town. The collective silence around this most visible of details is so total, so seamless, so completely without any crack or fissure, that it begins to feel less like an absence of curiosity and more like a choice, a sustained, community-wide agreement to simply never look. And once you start pulling at that thread, once you allow yourself to sit with the possibility that Springfield's residents are not incurious, but rather incapable of asking certain questions, a completely different version of the show begins to emerge. A version that was always there underneath the couch gags and the chalkboard jokes, waiting for someone to stop laughing long enough to notice it. The Simpsons premiered on December 17th, 1989. It was immediately recognized as something new, not just a cartoon for adults, though that framing dominated early coverage. Something with a specific emotional texture that other animated shows had not attempted. It was satirical without being cruel. It was cynical without being despairing. It knew exactly how much warmth to inject into a given scene to keep the viewer anchored in something that felt like love, even when the scene itself was built around failure or embarrassment or loss. The Simpson family was recognizably American in a way that felt almost aggressive. Homer's job at the nuclear power plant, Marge's immovable patience, Bart's chronic academic failure, Lisa's alienation, even the baby who never grew older, all of it assembled into a portrait of middle-class American family life that managed to be both affectionate and devastating at the same time. But the question of what kind of show it was, the question of whether the comedy was the point or the delivery vehicle for something else, that question was never really settled. It was assumed. It was called a comedy, slotted into the comedy category. Discussed in the language of comedy, the jokes were good, the timing was precise, the writing staff produced gags that have survived in cultural memory for 30 years. Of course it was a comedy. Except, The show that produced some of the most technically precise comedy in television history was also the show that gave us Homer sitting alone in a diner on Father's Day because his children forgot to call, eating a slice of pie, and watching the other families through the window. It was the show that gave us Marge crying silently in the car after a party, pulling herself together before anyone could see. It was the show that gave us Lisa writing letters to pen pals who never wrote back, and Bart staring at his own reflection in a moment of genuine, unguarded self-doubt, and Maggie reaching for her mother in a crowded room and being carried past without anyone noticing what her hands were doing. These scenes were not the setup for a punchline. They were not structured as jokes that landed on an emotional beat. They were placed inside episodes like stones dropped into water, creating ripples that the show did not follow up on, and did not explain, and did not ask the audience to process. They were just there, available to anyone who was watching closely enough to see them. The yellow skin is the most literal version of this dynamic. It is the detail that the show places in full view, inside every frame, visible to every viewer in every episode for 36 years, and trusts that most people will not think too hard about. Because most people do not. Because the show trained its audience very carefully to find the jokes and move on. But the details remained, accumulating, building a parallel text underneath the one the laugh track pointed at. To understand what the yellow skin is actually doing in the show, it helps to think about what yellow means as a color. Not in the art direction sense, where it is about recognition and distinctiveness, but in the cultural and psychological space that color occupies. Yellow is associated with caution, with warning signals, with the universal visual language of things that require attention. Every traffic light in the world uses yellow to tell drivers to prepare for a change. Every hazard sign reaches for yellow because the human eye responds to it with something that is not quite alarm but is adjacent to it. A readiness, a state of heightened notice. Springfield is a town populated by people colored in the international shade of warning, and nobody is warned. The power plant that sits at the edge of town, visible from most of Springfield on a clear day, has been leaking radioactive material into the surrounding environment for the entire run of the show. This is not a theory or an extrapolation. The show depicts it directly. Waste dumped into water, radioactive material repurposed as a paperweight, cooling systems patched with substances that were never designed for cooling. A surprise inspection that identified 342 individual safety violations. 342 separate ways the facility was failing to prevent the thing it was built to contain. The man responsible for preventing these violations, the safety inspector whose job is to stand between the town and catastrophe, is Homer Simpson, a man whose IQ the show's creator has described as 55. A man who, in a canonical episode, was found to have had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, physically reducing his cognitive function for his entire adult life. A man who has been photographed, on multiple occasions, sleeping at the instrument panel of an active nuclear reactor. And the entire town is yellow. The show is not hiding this. The show has never hidden it. Every episode that takes place in Springfield is saturated with evidence of a community that has been chemically altered by prolonged exposure to something its own institutions are failing to contain. The evidence is in the biology of every resident, visible in every frame, impossible to miss if you are looking for it. The question is why we were not looking. Part of the answer is that the show is genuinely funny. The jokes are real. The comedic timing across the show's golden seasons, roughly from the second season through the 8th or 9th, is as precise as anything produced in the medium. When Homer electrocutes himself and his hair stands up and then falls off in segments, that is funny. When Bart's prank calls to Moe's Tavern escalate over the seasons in elaborateness and absurdity, that is funny. When the show builds an elaborate structural joke across an entire episode and pays it off in the final 10 seconds with a callback so well constructed it makes you gasp and laugh simultaneously, that is art. But the comedy was doing something specific. It was providing a permission structure. It was telling the audience, at regular intervals, that what they were watching was safe. That the darkness visible in the corners of the frame was not really there, or if it was there as a setup, and the punchline was coming, and the punchline would make everything okay. This is what the best comedy has always done. It approaches unbearable things with the tools of lightness and absurdity, and it allows people to look at those things from an angle that makes them survivable. The comedy in The Simpsons was doing exactly this. It was making the brokenness of Springfield, the economic anxiety, the institutional failure, the accumulated damage done to ordinary people by systems far beyond their control. It was making all of that survivable by framing it as material for jokes. But surviving something and processing it are different things. And for 36 seasons, the show gave its audience the tools to survive Springfield without ever quite giving them the tools to understand it. The yellow skin is the purest distillation of this dynamic. It is the show's most comprehensive joke and its most comprehensive clue, housed in the same visual detail, delivered simultaneously in every frame. The joke is that this is just how the characters look. The clue is that this is how they look because of where they live, and what has been done to them, and what they have collectively agreed not to notice. There is a specific kind of storytelling that uses the unreliable surface of a text to conceal a more truthful substrate beneath it. The comedy in this reading is not the show. The comedy is what you see when you are watching the show without really watching it. The show itself, the actual structure of meanings and patterns and emotional investments that the episodes build across 36 seasons, is something quieter and stranger and more honestly heartbreaking. The yellow skin is the entry point. It is the detail that the show puts in front of you from the very first frame and trusts you to eventually ask about. Not in the first season, when everything is new and the jokes are landing and the characters are still being assembled into themselves, but eventually, after years, after the accumulation of seasons and episodes and recurring details starts to create a gravitational pull toward the question underneath all the other questions. Why are they yellow? What happened to these people? And why does nobody in this town ever stop to ask? The children of Springfield have been yellow since they were born. They did not arrive in this condition from somewhere else. They were produced this way by parents who were already this way, in a town that had already been this color for longer than any of the current residents have been alive. The yellowing is generational. It is baked into the biology of the community at the chromosomal level, passed from parent to child in a town where the air is never quite clean and the water is never quite clear, and the cooling towers on the edge of the residential district are always leaking something. The show established this with Blinky, the three-eyed fish pulled from the river near the power plant in Season 2, held up as evidence of environmental contamination so dramatic it became a campaign issue in a gubernatorial race. Burns was forced to eat the fish on live television to prove it was harmless. The town watched and accepted this as sufficient evidence and moved on. The question nobody asked in the episode, and the question the show trusted nobody in the audience would ask either, is what the contamination visible in the fish implied about the people drinking the same water. If the river near the plant was producing three-eyed fish, the river that also fed into the water table of a residential town, if the biological effects of that contamination were visible enough in aquatic life to become national news, what was it doing to the humans? The answer, visible in every frame of every episode, was that it was doing exactly what you would expect it to do. The yellow skin is not incidental. The yellow skin is the show's thesis, written in the color of caution, applied to every resident of a town built downstream from an industrial catastrophe and asked to carry it without complaint. Springfield did not complain. Springfield made jokes, and so did we. That is what makes the yellow skin such a devastating detail when you finally sit with it properly. It is not just an indictment of Springfield. It is not just a portrait of a community too damaged or too controlled or too collectively exhausted to acknowledge what has been done to it. It is also, quietly and precisely, a portrait of an audience that watched the same evidence for 36 years and called it a comedy and went to bed. We are Springfield. We have always been Springfield. We have been given the evidence in every frame, and we have chosen, as Springfield chose, to see only what was comfortable, to take the joke and leave the substrate alone. The show knew this. The show built itself around this. The jokes were good enough that the choice felt natural. The warnings were consistent enough that they constituted a record. And somewhere between the laughter and the comfort and the 36 years of returning to the same couch and the same family and the same cracked cooling towers visible on the horizon, the show was quietly, patiently, relentlessly making its actual case. Not a comedy. A document. The yellowing of Springfield is the document's first and most persistent piece of evidence. Everything else the show has to say is built on top of it, or grows out from it, or circles back to it in the end. Every character study, every quiet devastation, every moment where the laugh track falls away and something true is allowed to breathe for a few seconds before the jokes resume, All of it takes place in a town where the first thing anyone should have noticed was visible from the very first frame. The people are yellow. Nobody ever asked why. That silence, sustained for 36 years across hundreds of episodes and thousands of individual scenes, is not a gap in the narrative. It is the narrative. It is the show's most honest statement about the community it was depicting and about the audience watching it from their living rooms, in their own versions of Springfield, carrying their own versions of the same accumulated damage they have also chosen, for the sake of comfort, not to name. If you are watching this late at night or early in the morning, drop your time and where you are from in the comments below. And if you want more of this kind of breakdown, subscribe now so you never miss one. Number Section 2. The Grief Architecture of Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson is one of the most analyzed fictional characters in the history of American television, and somehow the most important thing about him remains the thing that gets discussed least. Not his stupidity, which is documented and quantified and made the source of hundreds of jokes per season. Not his appetite, which has become cultural shorthand for a particular kind of American excess. Not his relationship with his children, which is simultaneously the warmest and most dysfunctional parent-child dynamic the show produces. The most important thing about Homer Simpson is that he is a man who was broken before he was old enough to understand what was happening to him, and he spent the remaining decades of his life building a family with a level of desperate, almost violent love that only makes sense when you understand what the construction of that family was in response to. Homer's mother left when he was small. This is the foundational fact of his psychology, and it is a fact the show took 6 full seasons to reveal, which means it spent 6 years creating a character whose emotional logic was already fully legible once you had the key, but who appeared, without that key, to be simply chaotic, lovably stupid. A collection of appetites and impulse failures with a good heart underneath. Once you have the key, Homer is not chaotic at all. He is one of the most precisely constructed emotional portraits in the history of the medium. The episode that provides the key is Mother Simpson, Season 7, Episode 8. It aired in November of 1995, and it reframed every Homer story that had come before it without changing a single frame of those earlier episodes. The information revealed in Mother Simpson does not contradict anything established in the first 6 seasons. It explains it, all of it. Every moment of Homer's desperation for approval, every instance of his inability to walk away from a situation that was clearly destroying him, every scene where he chose to absorb punishment rather than risk the loss of something he valued, all of it snaps into coherence. The moment you understand that Homer Simpson was told his mother was dead and grew up believing it, Mona Simpson was not dead. She was in hiding. She had been radicalized in 1969, had participated in the destruction of a biological weapons laboratory owned by Charles Montgomery Burns, had been seen and identified by Burns himself during the raid, and had spent the following decades as a fugitive from federal prosecution while Burns made certain that the pursuit never stopped. She kissed her young son goodbye while he was sleeping and disappeared, and Homer woke up the next morning and his mother was gone. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, told him she had died. He showed Homer a grave, not his wife's grave, as it turned out, but the grave of a poet named Walt Whitman, a detail so specific and so strange that it could only have been chosen deliberately, as if the show wanted to mark the lie with the name of a man who spent his life writing about the American condition and the complicated relationship between the individual and the nation that shaped them. Homer mourned. He grew up mourning. He went through childhood and adolescence and into adulthood carrying the weight of a mother who he believed had died before she could see who he would become, and he built his entire personality around the absence she left. Consider what this means for the character that the first 6 seasons presented. Homer's need for validation from authority figures, including Burns, including his own father, including the various bosses and community leaders and experts who appear throughout the series, reads completely differently once you understand that he grew up believing he was the kind of son a mother would rather die than raise. That is what abandonment without explanation communicates to a child. Not the truth, which was that his mother left to protect him. The emotional truth, which was that he was not worth staying for. This is not a reading imposed onto the show from outside. The show makes it explicit in Mother Simpson and in the episodes that follow. When Mona returns, when Homer finally has the conversation with her that he has been owed his entire life, the joy in him is so enormous and so raw that the show cannot quite hold it within its usual comedic register. The scene plays almost straight. Homer does not make a joke. He does not stumble or fail or cause an accident. He just looks at his mother and he is happy in a way that the show has rarely allowed him to be. A happiness uncut by irony or consequence, given freely, briefly, and then taken away again when Burns spots Mona from a passing cab, and the FBI is called and she has to run again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time, and this time, unlike the first, he is awake for it. He knows what is happening. He knows who she is and what she means and what her leaving is going to cost him, and he cannot stop it. The episode ends with Homer sitting on the hood of his car in the dark, looking up at the stars. Marge comes to sit beside him. They do not say anything. The scene holds for longer than the show's comedy rhythms would usually allow, and the music plays underneath it, and the episode simply ends there with Homer in the dark, understanding for the first time in his life that his mother loved him, and having lost her again within hours of learning it. This is not a comedy scene. It was never trying to be. It is one of the finest pieces of sustained emotional writing the show ever produced, and it recontextualizes every Homer story before and after it. Before this episode, Homer's clinginess with Marge reads as endearing but slightly pathological. After it, the clinginess is revealed as the inevitable behavior of a man whose primary model of close emotional bonds is that they end without warning and without sufficient reason. Homer holds on to Marge with a ferocity that occasionally crosses into smothering, because somewhere beneath all the jokes and the hair-standing-up moments, and the food and the television, Homer is always quietly terrified that he is going to wake up one morning and she will be gone. He knows this terror does not make sense within the context of his marriage to Marge, who is the most consistently stable presence in his life. Marge is not his mother. Marge stays. Marge has stayed through things that would have ended a less stubborn marriage within the first season. But terror is not rational, and Homer's terror of abandonment was formed before he had the cognitive architecture to examine its origins, which means it operates below the level of his conscious processing and shapes his behavior in ways he cannot explain and cannot correct. The show uses this dynamic with a precision that only becomes fully visible in retrospect. Episodes that appear to be about Homer's immaturity or selfishness, episodes where he makes choices that damage his marriage or his relationship with his children, frequently have abandonment anxiety running underneath them as the actual engine of the story. Homer does not make bad choices because he is indifferent to the people in his life. He makes bad choices because his emotional regulation is compromised by a wound he has been carrying since childhood and has never been given the tools to address. This is clinical language for something the show describes through action and consequence rather than through explanation or diagnosis. The show never gives Homer a therapist. It never gives him a sustained conversation with another character about the emotional architecture of his psychology. It gives him Marge, and it gives him his children, and it gives him a couch and a television and a beer, and it watches what he does with those things and trusts the audience to understand what they are seeing. When you understand the wound, you understand the behavior. Every time Homer wraps his arms around Bart in a moment of genuine feeling, after the comedy of strangling has been exhausted and the scene arrives somewhere real, you are watching a man express something he does not have words for. Every time Homer looks at Marge across a room, and the expression on his face shifts from his default comic vacancy to something quieter and more serious, you are watching a man count his blessings in a language only he speaks fluently. The show understood something about grief that takes most people decades to learn. Grief does not present as sadness alone. Grief has many faces, and in adults who learn to carry it young, it tends to present as the thing you use to manage it. Homer uses food and television and laughter and a willingness to absorb punishment without complaint. These are his management strategies. They look like character flaws from the outside. From the inside, they are the architecture of survival. The crayon provides the clearest window into this dynamic. In a season 12 episode, Homer has a crayon removed from his brain, a crayon that had apparently lodged itself there during childhood and had been physically reducing his cognitive function for his entire adult life. With the crayon removed, Homer's IQ rises to a measurable genius level. He becomes articulate, perceptive, capable of engaging with the world around him in ways his previous self could not access. And it makes him desperately unhappy. Not because intelligence is bad, not because the show is making a cynical argument that stupidity is bliss, but because Homer, operating at full cognitive capacity, can finally see Springfield clearly. He can see his job for what it is. He can see the systemic failures of the community around him. He can see the gap between the life he is living and the life that a person of his actual capability might have lived under different circumstances. He can see himself, and seeing himself clearly, without the fog of reduced cognition, without the protective numbness that the crayon had been providing for decades, is unbearable. So he has the crayon put back in. The moment he makes that choice is one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever committed to. Homer Simpson chooses to be less than he could be because being more than he is would mean feeling the full weight of what has been done to him and what he has lost, and that weight is too great to carry consciously. He prefers the fog. He prefers the warmth and the beer and the television and the reduced IQ and the comfortable numbness to the clarity of understanding his own circumstances. This is not played as comedy. The scene acknowledges its own grief openly. Homer puts the crayon back with full knowledge of what he is doing, and the show allows the sadness of that choice to exist without a joke to soften it. What is particularly piercing about this moment is that Homer's choice to remain cognitively compromised is also, in some sense, a choice about his family. A Homer who could see Springfield clearly, who could understand the economic and institutional forces that have shaped his life, would be a Homer who might make different choices. A Homer who might seek a different job, a different town, different circumstances for his children, and that Homer, the clear-eyed version with the working brain, would not be the Homer who sits on the couch on Sunday evenings surrounded by his family and feels, despite everything, that his life is good. The fog allows him the happiness. The clarity would take it away. Homer chooses the fog and the family over the clarity and the consequences of understanding, and in doing so, he makes the choice that the show has always suggested is the center of him. He chooses his family. He chooses to remain the person who loves them, even if remaining that person means remaining diminished. This is the grief architecture of Homer Simpson. It is built on a maternal abandonment he did not understand and was never given the language to process. It is maintained by cognitive limitations that are partly biological, partly environmental, and partly chosen. It is expressed through a quality of love that is so large and so desperate that it occasionally becomes its own kind of disaster, causing the damage it was designed to prevent. The show surrounds this architecture with comedy so reliable and so technically accomplished that most viewers never look at the structure underneath. They see Homer fall down. They see Homer eat the food. They see Homer do the thing that makes Marge sigh, and the kids roll their eyes and the laugh track roll. And the show is comfortable with this, because the show's contract with its audience has always included a surface layer that can be consumed without going deeper. But the deeper layer is there. It has always been there. And it is not comedy. Homer's relationship with his father adds another dimension to this grief architecture that the show develops slowly across many seasons. Abe Simpson is a man who failed his son in a specific and documentable way. He lied. He told Homer his mother was dead when she was alive. He denied Homer the knowledge of where he came from and who loved him and why she had to go. And he maintained that lie for Homer's entire childhood and adolescence and most of his adult life, while Homer built his personality around a grief that was partially manufactured. The show does not excuse Abe for this, but it also does not villainize him in any simple way. Abe Simpson is himself a broken man, a veteran, a widower, a man living in a retirement home being visited occasionally by a son who loves him incompletely and a grandchildren who mostly find him bewildering. Abe made terrible choices from a position of his own grief and his own limitations, and the damage those choices caused rippled forward into the next generation in ways he probably did not intend and certainly did not track. This is the show's understanding of how damage works. It is not malicious usually. It is not even always conscious. It is the inevitable consequence of people who are themselves broken trying to raise children with the tools they have, which are the tools of their own brokenness, and the children growing up shaped by the tools rather than by the intention. Homer was not raised to be psychologically healthy. He was raised by a man who was not psychologically healthy, in a town that was systematically poisoning its residents, by circumstances that conspired to deprive him of the parent whose particular kind of love might have compensated for the damage being done elsewhere. And he arrived at adulthood as the person that environment produced. And he looked at his own children and he tried, desperately and imperfectly and with enormous love, to give them something better. Sometimes he succeeded. The episodes that capture this are the ones the show's fans tend to describe as genuinely moving rather than merely funny. Homer at Elisa's school recital, sitting quietly in the audience, watching his daughter play the saxophone with an expression of pure, uncomplicated pride that the show allows to last for a full beat before anything else happens. Homer and Bart watching a movie together late at night, both of them pretending to be asleep when Marge walks through, and the camera catching the small shared smile between them before they settle back into their performance of sleep. Homer and Maggie in the car, the camera catching Maggie's eyes in the rearview mirror, and Homer singing along to the radio without embarrassment or irony, just singing, just happy in this specific moment with this specific person. These moments are not jokes. They are not the setup for jokes. They are the show being honest about what Homer is at his core, underneath the apparatus of comedy that the show constructed around him. He is a man who loves his family with the specific ferocity of someone who knows from personal experience how quickly and how completely love can disappear. He loves them loudly and clumsily and sometimes destructively and always, always sincerely. The grief is the engine. The love is what the grief made when it had nowhere else to go. The show built one of American television's most beloved comedic characters from the raw material of maternal abandonment, cognitive impairment, economic anxiety, and a quality of love so large it kept spilling over into damage. And it made you laugh at him for 36 years, which is the most impressive part of the whole construction. Because it also made you love him. And the love and the laughter arrived together so consistently that they began to feel like the same thing, when in fact they were always separate. The laughter was the surface. The love was the recognition. The recognition that Homer Simpson's particular kind of brokenness, his particular way of failing and recovering and failing again and holding on to the people around him with both hands regardless, was not foreign or exotic or safely fictional. It was familiar. It was the specific texture of human life for a very large number of people watching from their own living rooms, in their own versions of Homer's situation, carrying their own versions of the crayon. The show made it funny because funny was the only way to make it bearable. But it was never really funny. It was always grief, wearing laughter as its most comfortable coat. Number Section 3. Marge's invisible collapse. Marge Simpson has the tallest hair in American television history. It rises straight up from her head in a blue tower that defies several laws of physics and at least one of chemistry, maintained in perfect shape across 36 years without any visible investment of time or product. It is the first thing anyone notices about her, and, in a way that the show has always understood and exploited, it is the last thing anyone looks past. The blue tower is armor. Beneath it is one of the most carefully observed portraits of female disappointment in the history of the medium, rendered across hundreds of episodes with a patience and a subtlety that the show's own comedy frequently obscured, and that most of its audience, even the devoted audience that has watched every episode and memorized every recurring joke, has never quite reckoned with. Marge Bouvier was valedictorian of her high school class. This detail is not planted in the early seasons when it might have been used to establish her character as something other than the patient wife in the background of Homer's stories. It emerges later, in flashback episodes, as a piece of biographical information that the show offers without comment, trusting the audience to notice what it implies. Marge Bouvier graduated at the top of her class. She was, by the available evidence, the most academically accomplished person in her graduating year. She had a facility for language, a demonstrated interest in art, a visible intelligence that her teachers recognized and that her peers must have noticed. She was the person in the room who could have gone anywhere. She went to Homer. The show does not present this as tragedy. The show is very careful not to present this as tragedy, because presenting it as tragedy would require acknowledging something about Marge's life that the show's fundamental premise cannot accommodate. The premise requires Marge to choose Homer, to keep choosing Homer, to build her entire adult life around a man and a family and a house on Evergreen Terrace. If the show acknowledged that this choice had costs, that something was lost when Marge's valedictorian intelligence was redirected from whatever trajectory it had been on and poured instead into managing Homer's disasters and raising 3 children and maintaining a household in a town that was never quite what she deserved, the comedy of Homer's failures would become much harder to laugh at. So the show is careful. It offers the information and then moves past it. It plants the evidence and trusts the audience to either pick it up or leave it, knowing that the architecture of the show's comedy will make leaving it the easier choice. But there are episodes, scattered across the seasons, where the show stops being careful, where it allows Marge's interiority to surface briefly before the comedy reasserts itself and the episode ends and everything goes back to normal. And in those episodes, something is visible that has no name in the show's vocabulary, but that every person watching from the right angle will recognize immediately. Marge is not okay. She has not been okay for a long time, and the specific way she is not okay has been constructed with such care, across such a long period, using such quiet tools, that it is possible to watch it happening for decades without ever quite naming it. The technical term is chronic self-suppression, the accumulation of choices made in service of other people's needs at the expense of one's own, over a long enough period, until the self that was being suppressed has retreated so far from the surface that the person doing the suppressing has genuinely lost access to it. The suppression becomes the personality, the patience becomes the identity, and the person inside, the valedictorian, the artist, the woman who could have become something that had nothing to do with Homer Simpson's disasters, that person waits in there, very quietly, for an opportunity that never quite arrives. The episodes that make this visible are not the ones usually cited when people discuss the show's emotional depth. They are not the landmark episodes with the iconic endings. They are the smaller episodes, the ones with lower cultural profile, the episodes where Marge is allowed to pursue something, to attempt something, to briefly inhabit a version of herself that is not entirely defined by her role in the Simpson household. There is the episode where Marge takes up painting. She discovers she has a genuine talent for it, which surprises no one who has been paying attention to her intelligence, and she produces work that is recognized by people with artistic expertise as worth taking seriously. For a brief period, Marge is an artist. She has something that belongs to her, something that exists outside the house and the children and Homer's needs. And then the episode's plot machinery requires that she give it up, or compromise it, or redirect her talent towards something that serves the family rather than herself. There is the episode where Marge becomes a police officer. She is good at it. She has instincts for the work, an ability to read situations and respond with judgment rather than reaction, a quality of patience under pressure that turns out to be genuinely useful in law enforcement, even though the show spent years using that same patience as the butt of jokes. For a brief period, Marge has a professional identity that is hers, and then the episode's plot machinery reasserts itself. There is the episode where Marge develops a gambling problem, which stands out because it represents something the show almost never allows Marge to have: a need that is irrational, a behavior that is self-destructive, a hunger that operates outside the boundaries of her carefully maintained composure. The gambling is Marge's ID breaking through the conditioning, and the show treats it with genuine empathy rather than comedic judgment, which is unusual enough to be striking. But the episode ends. The problem is resolved. The composure returns. What is striking about all of these episodes, when you look at them as a sequence rather than as individual installments, is the pattern they reveal. Marge repeatedly finds something that belongs to her: a skill, an identity, a passion, a need, and the show repeatedly finds a reason for that thing to be taken away, or redirected, or resolved into something that brings her back to the baseline of the devoted wife and mother in the house on Evergreen Terrace. The show is not cruel about this. The show is not making an argument that Marge should not have these things. But the plot structure of the show, the very architecture of how episodes are built, keeps returning Marge to the same position. And across 36 seasons, this return starts to feel less like comedic convenience and more like a statement about the lives of women who are primarily defined by their relationships to others. Marge's marriage to Homer is genuinely loving. This is important to say, because the alternative reading of the previous paragraphs might suggest that Homer is the villain of Marge's story, and he is not. Homer loves Marge with the particular ferocity established in the previous section, and Marge loves Homer in a way that the show depicts as equally real, equally chosen, and equally the product of seeing him clearly for who he is, rather than for who she might have wanted him to be. But love does not prevent loss. Love and loss are frequently the same thing, or at least they share the same address. Marge chose Homer, and she chose her children, and she chose the life on Evergreen Terrace. And those choices were real, and they were made with her eyes open, and they also had costs that the show acknowledges quietly in the episodes where Marge's interior life is briefly permitted to surface. There is a recurring visual motif in the show that fans have noticed without always naming what it means. Marge, alone in a room, after the children have gone to bed and Homer has fallen asleep in front of the television. The house is quiet. The camera holds on her face. She is doing something ordinary, washing dishes, folding laundry, sitting at the kitchen table. And the expression on her face in these moments is not the patient composure she wears during the day, it is something else. Something the show does not caption or explain. A particular quality of stillness that could be read as contentment or could be read as its opposite, and the show, very deliberately, does not tell you which it is. It trusts you to bring your own reading to it, which means it trusts that some percentage of its audience, the people watching from a similar position, will bring a reading that the show itself cannot say out loud without breaking the contract of its own premise. Marge's relationship with her sisters, Patty and Selma, illuminates her interior life from an angle the show does not always make available. Patty and Selma do not like Homer. They have never liked Homer. They have been consistent and vocal about their view that Marge married beneath herself, that the life on Evergreen Terrace represents a diminishment of what Marge could have been, that the woman they grew up with, the valedictorian, the talented one, the one with the potential, is somewhere inside the patient wife, and she is not receiving adequate care. The show frames this as an annoying quirk of the sisters' personalities. They are written as unpleasant women whose dislike of Homer is partly personal and partly the result of their own unhappiness being projected onto Marge's marriage. And this framing is not entirely wrong. Patty and Selma are not happy people, and their criticism of Homer does contain a dimension of self-interested projection. But they are also not entirely wrong. And the show knows they are not entirely wrong, because it gives Marge moments of genuine agreement with their assessment, moments that arrive and are quickly covered over by the comedy and the resolution of the episode, but that are there for the watching. The most significant of these moments occur in the episodes that deal directly with the state of the Simpsons' marriage. There are several across the show's run, usually structured around a crisis that brings the relationship to a precipice before the episode pulls back and restores the status quo. In the moments before the restoration, when the marriage is at its most genuinely threatened, Marge is allowed to articulate something real. She wanted more. She has always wanted more. Not necessarily more than Homer, because her love for Homer is genuine, and the show would not be honest if it pretended otherwise. But more than this. More than the life that the specific combination of Homer's disasters and her own suppressive tendencies has produced. More room. More space for the person inside who is not being given adequate opportunity to exist. The show cannot resolve this want. The show's premise is that the Simpsons are together, that the family persists, that Evergreen Terrace is home and always will be home. Marge's want exists in permanent irresolution, which is one of the most honest things the show does. Because permanent irresolution is the actual condition of a great many human lives, and depicting it honestly required the show to allow Marge to carry it across 36 seasons without pretending it ever went away. The blue tower is the armor for that carrying. It is the most visible thing about her, the thing that announces her immediately, and it is also the thing that conceals the most. Behind the impossible hair and the patient composure, and the gentle sighs and the capacity to manage everything that Homer creates, there is a woman who graduated at the top of her class and who has spent most of her adult life wondering, in the quiet moments that the show allows her when everyone else is asleep, what would have happened if she had kept going. She does not regret her children. She does not regret the love. But the regret is there, available, carefully contained behind the armor she built for it when she was young, and the armor has held perfectly across 3.5 decades of continued deployment. The show's title is The Simpsons, plural, which theoretically distributes the narrative weight across the whole family. But the cultural understanding of the show tends to treat it as Homer's show, with Marge as the stable background element against which Homer's foreground chaos is visible. This understanding is not entirely wrong, but it misses something essential. Marge is not the background. Marge is the structure. The whole thing, the entire architecture of the family, the reason Homer's chaos is survivable, and his love is able to function, and his children turn out to be the specific people they become, all of it runs on Marge. She is the foundation that makes the building possible. And foundations are invisible, by design. You do not see the foundation of a building. You see the walls, the roof, the windows. You see what the foundation makes possible. You do not see what the foundation costs. The show sees it. The show has always seen it. The show chose, early on, to put Marge's interiority in the negative space of the episodes, in the pauses and the moments when the comedy stepped back, in the recurring visual motif of the woman alone in the quiet house, carrying something the show did not have a word for, but that the camera, in those held moments, described with perfect precision. Marge Bouvier was valedictorian. She made her choice. She carries it without complaint, in the way that people who are very good at carrying things without complaint always do, which is to say invisibly, sustainably, and at a cost that accumulates over time into something the accounting of the show can never quite capture, though it has been trying for 36 years. Number. Section 4. Bart Simpson was never the problem. The cultural consensus on Bart Simpson was formed quickly and held firmly for years. He was the bad kid, the troublemaker, the child who would not comply, would not sit down, would not be quiet, would not perform the behaviors that school and family and community asked of him. The underachiever, by self-proclamation, and proud of it. His face on millions of t-shirts, his catchphrases repeated on playgrounds across the world, his status as icon of juvenile delinquency, so thoroughly established that an entire moral panic about the cultural influence of children's entertainment organized itself around him in the early 1990s. Then the show continued, and Bart continued, and across season after season and episode after episode, a different picture assembled itself underneath the cultural consensus. Quietly, without press releases or dramatic narrative pivots, the show began to reveal what Bart's behavior actually was, where it came from, what it was responding to, and why. If you looked at the specific conditions of his life with the same analytical patience you might bring to any other child in the same circumstances, the underachievement and the pranks and the chronic authority defiance were not the symptoms of a bad character at all. They were the symptoms of a child doing the only thing available to him. Bart Simpson is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old for 36 years. Within the logic of Springfield's floating timeline, this creates a particular kind of pressure that the show has never directly addressed, but has always been aware of. Bart is trapped. He is trapped not just in the general sense that the floating timeline traps all of Springfield's residents, but in the specific developmental sense that 10 is a particular age in a child's life. It is the age just before adolescence, the age when a child's personality is fully assembled but their autonomy is still entirely constrained, the age when the world begins to be visible in its complexity, but the tools to navigate that complexity are not yet available. Bart has been at that age for 36 years. He has had the intelligence to see how the world works without the agency to affect it. He has understood, with the specific clarity of the unusually perceptive 10-year-old, that the systems surrounding him, the school, the family, the town, are not organized with his best interests at their center. And he has responded to this understanding in the only way a 10-year-old can respond, which is through disruption, through mischief, through the strategic deployment of chaos against structures he cannot yet dismantle and will not yet pretend to respect. Springfield Elementary is the clearest example of how the show uses Bart's behavior as diagnostic rather than comedic. Principal Skinner, as the school's authority figure, represents an institution that has failed Bart in specific and documentable ways. The curriculum is not designed for the way Bart's mind works. The discipline system is punitive rather than corrective. The cultural assumptions about what constitutes intelligence, assumptions that elevate Lisa's particular brand of academic performance and pathologize Bart's particular brand of embodied, improvisational, interpersonally skilled intelligence, are baked into every interaction Bart has with the school. Bart is not stupid. The show establishes this with care across many episodes, usually in contexts outside the school environment, where the criteria for intelligence are different. He is extraordinarily socially intelligent. He reads people with an accuracy that adults twice his age frequently fail to match. He is creative in ways that the school's assessment system is not designed to measure. He is brave in ways that require genuine intelligence to be useful, rather than simply reckless. He is loyal with a consistency and depth that the show presents as one of his finest qualities, even when the object of his loyalty is someone who has not quite earned it. What Bart lacks is the capacity or the inclination to perform the specific behaviors that Springfield Elementary has decided constitute being a good student. And Springfield Elementary, like most institutions built around compliance rather than curiosity, has responded to this discrepancy by treating Bart as the problem. The episode that makes this explicit is not one of the show's landmark installments. It is a smaller episode, a quieter one. in which Bart briefly gets his hands on a standardized test that reveals his actual intellectual potential to be significantly higher than his academic performance suggests. The discovery creates a brief crisis for Bart and for the school, before the plot machinery reasserts itself and returns everything to the established baseline. But the moment of discovery is real, and it is treated as real. Bart looks at the evidence that he is smarter than anyone around him has been treating him as, and his response is not triumph or vindication, but something more complicated. He has been told for his entire academic life that he is not capable, and some part of him has accepted this. The evidence to the contrary produces a kind of cognitive dissonance that the show handles with unusual gentleness, aware that it is touching something that matters. What the show understands about Bart, and what the early cultural consensus missed entirely, is that his rebellion is not random and it is not mindless. It is targeted. It is aimed, with reasonable precision, at the specific structures and authority figures that have failed him. Skinner, who sees Bart as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be educated. The curriculum, which does not meet him where he is. The assessment system, which measures only the things it already values. The cultural narrative about what a good kid looks like, which Bart does not fit and has never tried to fit. The mischief is not the problem. The mischief is the response to the problem. The problem is a school system and a cultural context that looked at a child of genuine intelligence and unusual capability and decided, because he did not conform to its expectations, that he was deficient. This is the show's thesis on Bart, stated quietly across many episodes without ever being framed as a thesis. The bad kid is not bad. The bad kid is 10 years old and has been placed in a system that has decided in advance that he is a failure, and he has responded to this decision with the only tools available to him, which are creativity and mischief, and a complete refusal to pretend that the system's judgments have validity. Bart's relationship with Homer adds another dimension to this reading. Homer is a complicated father. He is warm and loving in the direct, uncomplicated way established in the previous section, but he is also the parent who started Bart's life story in a particularly fraught way. The flashback episodes reveal that Bart's birth was the specific event that locked Homer into the power plant job, the event that closed off the version of Homer's life where he might have pursued something with more possibility. Homer was about to quit the plant when Marge told him she was pregnant. He went back. He has been there since. Bart, in the story Homer tells himself about his own life, is the moment the door closed. Homer does not tell Bart this. Homer would never tell Bart this. The love is real, and the guilt about the implicit narrative is buried so deep it probably does not register as guilt at any conscious level. But the dynamic between Homer and Bart, the specific quality of their relationship, carries this history in its texture. Homer's frustration with Bart is partly the frustration of watching someone make the choices he could not, of seeing Bart refuse the compliance that Homer accepted without examination. Homer strangling Bart at regular intervals is, on the comedic surface, a running gag. Below that surface, it is the expression of a frustration that has no legitimate object but finds one anyway. The show knows this. The show has always known this, because it gives Homer and Bart their most honest conversations at moments of genuine emotional exposure, usually late at night when the performance of the family's normal dynamic has been suspended. In these conversations, something real passes between them, a recognition. Homer sees something of himself in Bart that he cannot quite articulate, and Bart sees something in Homer that makes the strangling episodes look different than they appear from the outside. They are more similar than either of them is comfortable acknowledging. Homer was a kid who did not fit. Bart is a kid who does not fit. Homer resolved this by accepting the systems around him at enormous personal cost. Bart refuses that resolution, and the refusal costs him differently, but perhaps less. The show does not provide a verdict on which strategy is better. It presents both with equal fidelity, allowing the viewer to sit with the comparison. The relationship that reveals most about Bart, though, is not with Homer. It is with Lisa. Bart and Lisa are siblings who operate from completely different positions in every social and academic and cultural hierarchy Springfield offers. Lisa is recognized, by the school and by most adults in Springfield, as exceptional. Her intelligence is legible in the conventional ways, through test scores and performances, and the visible markers of academic achievement. Bart is recognized as a failure in those same conventional terms. And yet their relationship, the specific texture of how they move through the world together, is built on a mutual recognition that neither of them has with anyone else. They see each other. Bart sees Lisa's loneliness, the cost of being the smartest person in the room in a town that does not value intelligence, and he is one of the few people in her life who responds to this with something other than dismissal or envy. Lisa sees Bart's capability, the intelligence and loyalty and creativity that the school's assessment system cannot capture, and she is one of the few people in his life who regards him as something other than a problem. The episodes that put them in genuine collaboration, that require them to function as a team toward a shared goal, are some of the show's best. They work together with a fluency that suggests a much deeper mutual understanding than either of them would admit in ordinary circumstances. And the moments when one of them is in genuine distress, not comedic distress but real emotional exposure, the other is frequently the person who responds. The show uses their relationship to make an argument that it never states directly. The ways we categorize children, the ways we decide who is good and who is a problem, the ways we use performance on standardized measures to determine who deserves investment and who can be managed until they age out of the system, are not neutral assessments of actual capability. They are the output of systems with specific values, and the children who do not reflect those values back to the system are not deficient. They are just not the thing the system was designed to recognize. Bart is not the thing Springfield Elementary was designed to recognize. He never was. And the show's sustained portrait of his life, across 36 seasons at the same age, in the same classroom, against the same institutional resistance, is not a comedy about a bad kid. It is a case study in what happens to children who are capable of things the institutions around them are not capable of seeing. Section 5. Lisa and the Loneliness Engine. 8 years old. Lisa Simpson has been 8 years old since December of 1989. And in that time she has become the most complete portrait of gifted childhood loneliness in the history of American television. This is a specific claim, and it deserves specific support. The loneliness of a gifted child is different from ordinary childhood loneliness. Though ordinary childhood loneliness is real and painful, and the show depicts that too, in Bart's particular register and in Maggie's particular silence. The loneliness of a gifted child has a specific texture that comes from the gap between the child's internal experience and the social environment's capacity to meet it. The gifted child sees more, processes more, feels more, asks more. And the world around that child, which was not designed with the gifted child's particular needs at its center, often cannot respond to the fullness of what the child brings. The result is a particular kind of isolation. The gifted child is in the room. The gifted child is participating, trying to participate, often trying very hard to participate in the social structures that the other children navigate with more ease. But there is a glass wall between them, invisible and impenetrable, and the child can see through it clearly but cannot pass through it, and the other children do not seem to know it is there. Lisa has been standing behind that glass wall for 36 years, and the show has been honest about this in a way that is remarkable, given how easily it could have resolved the loneliness into comedy or sentiment and moved on. Lisa's saxophone is the most important object in the show. More important than Homer's couch, more important than Bart's skateboard, more important than the kitchen table around which the family gathers in the opening credits. The saxophone is where Lisa is most fully herself, which means it is the place in the show where the glass wall disappears, because music does not require the social reciprocity that language requires. When Lisa plays, she is not asking the world to meet her. She is simply existing at full capacity, and the full capacity of her existence is something the saxophone can hold in a way that the classroom and the family dinner table and the Springfield playground cannot. The show understands this. The moments when Lisa plays are not scored the way the comedy scenes are scored. They are allowed to breathe. The camera stays on her. The jazz phrasing that the show has always associated with her interiority, a musical vocabulary that has nothing to do with Springfield's ordinary sonic landscape and everything to do with the specific emotional world Lisa inhabits, emerges from the saxophone, and the show simply lets it play. These are the moments when the show is most honest about what Lisa is. She is not a character type, though she is often described as one. The brilliant principled child, the one who raises uncomfortable questions and refuses to stop raising them even when the social cost becomes significant. That type exists in many shows. Lisa is not that type. Lisa is something more particular and more painful, because the show gave her interiority, gave her a genuine inner life that the saxophone was designed to express and then surrounded that interiority with a world that could not receive it. Lisa wants to be understood. This is her defining want, and it runs through every significant story the show tells about her. She is not primarily interested in being recognized for her intelligence, though recognition is something she has wanted and rarely received. She is primarily interested in being known, in having another person see the actual texture of her interior experience and respond to it with genuine attention. This almost never happens in Springfield. The town's social infrastructure is not organized around the kind of careful mutual attention that understanding requires. Springfield runs on noise and consensus and the management of collective anxiety through distraction, and Lisa's need for genuine understanding is not something that infrastructure can supply. The substitute teacher episodes are the clearest articulation of this dynamic. When Springfield Elementary briefly gains a teacher, usually a visiting expert of some kind, who actually has the capacity to meet Lisa where she is, the effect on her is immediate and overwhelming. She falls in love. Not romantically, or not only romantically, but with the specific, desperate attachment of someone who has been starved for genuine intellectual and emotional reciprocity and suddenly finds themselves in the presence of someone who can provide it. And then, because the plot requires it and because Springfield cannot hold that kind of attention permanently, the teacher leaves, or the episode ends, or the circumstances change. And Lisa is returned to the baseline of her ordinary isolation with the additional weight of having been briefly, tantalizingly close to something she needed and then having it taken away. The show does this to Lisa repeatedly. It gives her the thing she needs and then removes it. Not cruelly, or not performatively cruelly, but with the casual cruelty of a universe that is organized around other priorities and does not have the capacity to sustain what Lisa requires. Every time the thing is given and then taken, Lisa learns the lesson slightly more deeply. The lesson is not that she should stop wanting. The lesson is that wanting costs something, and the cost is the specific pain of the gap between what you need and what the world can offer. This lesson has been accumulating for 36 years at 8 years old, and the show has been watching Lisa absorb it without ever suggesting she should stop absorbing it. Lisa keeps wanting. Lisa keeps asking the uncomfortable questions and raising the inconvenient issues and trying to pull the people around her into engagement with ideas and realities they would rather avoid. She does this even though it costs her socially. She does this even though it has never been the strategy that gets her what she most wants, which is genuine connection. She does it because she cannot do otherwise. This is the most honest thing the show says about Lisa. She is not performing her intelligence or her principled stances as a strategy for social advancement. She is simply being what she is, and what she is happens to be incompatible with the social environment she was born into, and she keeps being it anyway, at considerable personal cost, because the alternative, which would be to suppress the thing that makes her who she is something she has watched Marge do and something she has watched Homer do in his own way, and she has seen what that suppression costs. Lisa's relationship with her father illuminates this from a specific angle. Homer loves Lisa with the sincerity established in the grief architecture section. He attends her recitals. He makes genuine efforts to understand her interests. He is often unsuccessful at those efforts, but the efforts are real and the love behind them is real, and Lisa knows this. What Lisa cannot quite get from Homer, and what the show is careful about depicting without sentimentalizing, is the particular kind of engagement that her intelligence requires. Homer cannot follow Lisa into the places her mind goes. He cannot hold a conversation about the things she is thinking about with the depth those things deserve. He loves her, but he cannot know her, and the gap between love and knowing is one of the central emotional territories the show maps across Lisa's story. The episode that makes this most visible is the one in which Homer briefly becomes intelligent, following the crayon removal discussed in the Homer section. For a brief period, Homer and Lisa can talk. They can actually talk, in the full sense, following each other's ideas, responding to the actual content of what the other is saying, existing together in the intellectual space that Lisa has always occupied alone. And Lisa's joy in this is so large and so unguarded that it is almost unbearable to watch, because you know, as you are watching, that it will not last. When Homer has the crayon reinserted and his intelligence returns to its normal level, the conversation ends. The ability to fully meet Lisa ends. And Lisa absorbs this loss with the specific stoicism of someone who has been practicing this particular kind of absorption for her entire life. The saxophone plays. The show continues. Lisa remains 8 years old, behind her glass wall, watching the world through it with full comprehension and reaching toward it with the specific kind of hope that does not require the evidence of previous success to justify itself. The show has been asked, occasionally, whether it intends for Lisa to be read as autobiographical in some sense. The answer, from the people who made it, is complicated and partial. But the precision of her interiority, the specific texture of her loneliness, the accuracy of the show's portrait of what it feels like to be the person in the room who sees everything and cannot make the room see back, suggests that someone in the writing room knew this experience from the inside. The loneliness engine runs on that knowledge. It runs on the specific understanding that some children are born into a gap between their capacity and their circumstances, and that the gap does not close with time, and that the appropriate response to living inside it is not to become smaller but to keep playing, which is what Lisa does every time the saxophone comes out, and the jazz phrasing rises over Springfield, and the show forgets, briefly, to be a comedy. In those moments, it is just a girl playing music that nobody around her quite understands, in a town that was not built to hold her, making sound that is more beautiful than anything the town deserves. Number. Section 6. The secondary characters who carried the weight. Springfield is populated by one of the richest ensembles in the history of American television. The secondary characters who inhabit the town's margins, who recur across seasons without ever quite achieving the narrative centrality of the Simpson family, have accumulated over 36 years into something extraordinary. A full community, each member carrying a specific story that the show has developed across hundreds of episodes with a patience and a consistency that most programs would not spend on their primary characters. 4 of these secondary characters deserve particular attention because 4 of them, more than any others, carry the show's most sustained meditations on failure, on the cost of intelligence, on the specific damage done by systems to the individuals inside them. Sideshow Bob is the first. The cultural shorthand for Sideshow Bob is the recurring villain who tries to kill Bart and fails. The character has been doing this since season 1, appearing in approximately 14 episodes across the show's run, always with an elaborate scheme, always foiled by the specific combination of Bart's instincts and his own theatrical vanity. The Sideshow Bob episodes are among the most technically accomplished comedic installments the show has ever produced. They are built like opera. They have the structure of high tragedy wearing the costume of low farce. This is not accidental. Sideshow Bob is voiced by Kelsey Grammer, who spent most of his career playing characters with a specific quality of thwarted dignity, and Grammer's vocal performance gives Bob a richness and complexity that the comedic role does not require but benefits enormously from. Bob is funny in the way that King Lear is occasionally funny. He is funny because his suffering is so operatically out of proportion to its causes, because his intelligence is so obviously excessive for his circumstances, because the gap between who he believes himself to be and what he has actually done with his life is so vast, it produces a particular kind of comedy that also aches. Sideshow Bob is, by the show's own accounting, one of the most intelligent people in Springfield. His knowledge of literature, opera, architecture, and classical music is genuine and extensive. His strategic mind, visible in every scheme he constructs, is capable of a level of long-term planning and contingency management that the show's other antagonists cannot match. He went to Yale. He has genuine aesthetic sensibility, a genuine appreciation for beauty in its most refined forms. He has spent the last several decades attempting to murder a 10-year-old child. The joke is obvious and the show knows it. What the show also knows, and what it has built into Bob's character across his 14 appearances, is that the gap between Bob's self-image and his actual circumstances is not simply a character flaw, but a symptom of something. Bob was a clown's sidekick. His talent was visible enough that he was invited into proximity with Krusty's show, but the structural position he was offered, silent, subordinate, physically abused for laughs, was not a position that a man of his capabilities could occupy without the accumulated humiliation of it, eventually producing something toxic. The show frames Bob's original crime, framing Krusty for a robbery and having him imprisoned, as the act of a man whose vanity had finally overridden his judgment. This is accurate as far as it goes, but underneath the vanity is the accumulated injury of years spent as the less important person in a room he was too intelligent to be merely decorating. Bob is what happens when significant capability is placed in a subordinate structural position for long enough. The capability does not disappear, it redirects. The subsequent obsession with Bart is harder to explain through pure character logic, and the show has never fully explained it, which is part of what makes the character interesting. The most honest reading is that Bart represents, for Bob, the specific category of person who has always stood between him and the recognition he believes his intelligence deserves. Bart is the one who keeps exposing him, the one who keeps winning despite having no apparent formal intelligence advantage, the one whose particular kind of capability, improvisational, socially sharp, physically brave, is exactly the kind of capability that Bob's education and sophistication did not prepare him to counter. Bob hates Bart the way the formally educated sometimes hate the intuitively capable, with a precise and comprehensive fury that is also, underneath the fury, something adjacent to admiration. Krusty the Clown is the second character who carries the show's real weight, and the weight he carries is about the particular sadness of the performer who has lost the connection between the performance and any authentic self beneath it. Krusty has been performing for so long, in the specific register of his television clown persona, that the persona has swallowed the person. The show gives us glimpses of what might be underneath. Herschel Schmoikel Pinchas Yeruchim Krustovsky, the son of a rabbi who wanted his son to follow him into religious life, who chose entertainment instead and paid for that choice with his father's long estrangement. The estrangement was eventually resolved, in one of the show's warmer installments. But the resolution came late and did not undo the decades of carrying both the performance and the weight of the broken relationship simultaneously. Krusty is addicted to gambling, to cigarettes, to the attention that the performance provides and that nothing else in his life can substitute. He has been married multiple times. He has relationships with his daughter that the show develops with genuine tenderness in later seasons. He has health problems so extensive that they constitute their own recurring subplot. He is, by the available evidence, a man in the process of being consumed by the machine of his own professional identity. What the show finds in Krusty, across the episodes that give him narrative room to expand, is something that it finds in several of its most significant characters. The cost of performing a version of yourself that is not the fullest version, sustained over enough time, becomes a kind of disappearance. The performer and the person become indistinguishable, not because the performance is genuine, but because the person has been so thoroughly redirected into the performance's needs that they can no longer locate themselves outside it. Krusty knows he is not the clown. He knows this intellectually. But the knowing does not produce the access, and the show is honest about this. Knowing that you have lost yourself to a performance is not the same as being able to recover yourself. The knowledge is available and the recovery is not. Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon, the proprietor of the Quick E-Mart, represents something different and more complicated, and the show's relationship with this character has been reconsidered publicly in ways that require acknowledgement. The character became the center of a significant cultural conversation about representation and caricature, and that conversation has validity. The accent, the cultural reduction, the specific ways the character's Indianness was deployed as a source of comedy, these are legitimate criticisms of a specific failure in how the show handled a character from an ethnic background, not represented in the show's predominantly white writing room. And yet the show also gave Apu, in its better moments, something that the criticism has occasionally obscured. It gave him a story. A genuine, specific, emotionally inhabited story about immigration and aspiration and the specific quality of pride that comes from building a life in a country that did not start as yours. Apu has a PhD. He has a family he loves with evident sincerity. He has a relationship with his community, his customers at the Quickie Mart, that the show depicts as genuinely warm rather than merely transactional. He has been in Springfield for decades, and he has built himself into it with a specific energy, an investment in this particular community that is not the behavior of a man who regards his circumstances as merely temporary. The show failed him in the ways that have been publicly documented, but in the gaps between the failures, there is a portrait of immigrant experience that is more honest than the caricature surface suggests. Apu works the hours he works not because the joke requires it, but because the show understands something about the specific economic position of the small business owner. The immigrant small business owner in particular, whose margin for error is so thin and whose investment in making the business work is so total that the boundary between person and enterprise essentially dissolves. The fourth character who carries weight is Nelson Muntz, and he carries weight of a kind that the show rarely foregrounds, but has been developing quietly since the earliest seasons. Nelson is Bart's friend, or one of Bart's friends, occupying a specific position in the social ecology of Springfield Elementary as the kid from the wrong side of the tracks, the one whose home circumstances are so visibly unstable that he has been producing his own stability through toughness since before he had a vocabulary for what he was doing. The show gives Nelson an absent father and a mother who is barely present, and it plays this initially for the specific comedic note of the child too young to be managing the things he is managing. But the comedy gradually gives way to something more serious, as Nelson's circumstances are allowed to accumulate. The toughness is real, and it is functional, but the show is careful to show the cost of it. Nelson is not performing toughness. He is living it, because the alternative, which is acknowledging the vulnerability of his actual position, is something he cannot afford. The most significant Nelson episodes are the ones that put him in proximity to genuine warmth, usually through his friendship with Bart and occasionally through his relationship with Lisa, which the show develops with unexpected delicacy in the episodes where they are allowed to be close. Nelson receives genuine warmth with a discomfort that is entirely legible. He does not know how to hold it. He has not had enough practice. The warmth reaches him and he responds with something that is trying to be casual and is actually desperate, and the show watches this without commenting on it, trusting the watching to do the work. These four characters, Bob, Krusty, Apu, Nelson, are Springfield at its best and its most honest. They are the town's secondary text, the story the show was telling in the margins while the primary narrative unfolded in the Simpson household on Evergreen Terrace. They are what happens when you extend your sympathy beyond the central family and into the community that surrounds it, and you discover that the community is made of people who are also, each in their own way, carrying things the show will only illuminate if you are willing to look. The ensemble is one of the things that makes the show genuinely unlike anything that preceded it. Not the size of it, which is large, but the consistency with which each secondary character has been maintained as a person rather than a type across 36 seasons. Springfield is not a backdrop for The Simpsons. It is a community, populated by people whose lives are as complex, as painful, and as intermittently beautiful as the lives of the family at its center. Number. Section 7. Springfield as a character. Before there was The Simpsons, there was a problem. The problem was that American situation comedies of the 1980s had largely settled into a geography of the interior. They took place in apartments, in workplaces, in clearly defined domestic spaces where the limited sets of a given show became the entire world. The outside existed only as the thing characters briefly inhabited between scenes set inside. The city or town or neighborhood that theoretically surrounded the main characters was available as a concept but not as a texture. Springfield was built differently. Matt Groening and his collaborators constructed a town before they constructed a show, or they constructed them simultaneously, which amounts to the same thing. Springfield had a geography, an economy, a class structure, an institutional landscape, a history, a relationship with the surrounding environment that the show's episodes could draw on and complicate and contradict across decades of storytelling. The town was a living document, constantly being annotated, occasionally being revised, growing richer and stranger with each season's accumulation of detail. The result, 36 seasons in, is something unprecedented in the history of American animation. A fictional American community so fully realized, so internally consistent in its emotional logic even when its geography contradicts itself, so thoroughly inhabited by the people who live in it and the people who made it, that it constitutes a genuine work of American social portraiture. Springfield is, at the level of its economic structure, a company town. The nuclear power plant is the single largest employer in the area, the single largest source of electrical power, and the facility whose environmental outputs define the conditions under which everyone in the town lives. Charles Montgomery Burns owns the plant. Burns owns, through the plant, the town's economy. And through the town's economy, Burns owns the political infrastructure, the institutional relationships, and the social dynamics of a community that is too dependent on his facility to resist him, and too damaged by it to fully understand what has been done to them. This is not a reading imposed on the show from outside. The show depicts this directly across multiple episodes. The moment when Burns briefly loses control of the plant, when German investors purchase it and attempt to bring it up to code, is the moment when the show makes clearest how completely the town's existence is structured around the plant's continued operation. The investors nearly go bankrupt from the cost of compliance. The economy wobbles. Burns buys it back and the wobble stops, and everyone, including the people who were most damaged by the plant's violations, returns to a baseline of relief that the uncertainty is over. The town chose the devil it knew. The town chose the certainty of continued poisoning over the uncertainty of what structural change might cost. This is not a stupid choice given the circumstances. It is a rational response to a situation in which every available option has significant costs, and the cost of the familiar option is at least quantifiable. But it is also a deeply sad choice. The choice of people who have been living inside a damaged system long enough that the damage feels like the baseline and the alternative feels like risk. Springfield's geography, discussed at length in the transcript that preceded this script, reflects this damaged quality in its physical impossibility. The town has mountains and oceans and deserts within driving distance. It borders multiple states simultaneously depending on which episode you are watching. Its buildings contain spatial impossibilities. Its distances contract and expand according to plot necessity rather than physical law. The show has always offered this geographic impossibility as a comedy premise. Springfield is everywhere and nowhere. It is every American town. This is true as an artistic intention, but it is also true as a description of the psychological state of the town's residents, whose internal geography, whose sense of where they are in the world and what their position in it means, has been similarly distorted by the accumulated effects of living in a community built on denial and managed through distraction. People who cannot rely on accurate environmental information eventually lose their calibration for what accurate environmental information feels like. If the water has always been this color, you stop noticing the color. If the air has always had this quality, you stop registering it as a quality. If the town has always been unable to locate itself on a map, the inability starts to feel like a feature rather than a symptom. Springfield's class structure is as carefully observed as its geography, and significantly more painful. The show depicts, across its run, a town with a rigid economic hierarchy that is maintained not through the usual mechanisms of opportunity and meritocracy, but through the specific tools of institutional dependency and cognitive limitation that Burns has spent over a century perfecting. At the top, Burns, alone, genuinely alone, surrounded by Smithers and by the infrastructure of his own wealth, but fundamentally isolated from genuine human connection, by the specific quality of a man who has lived long enough to stop being surprised by anyone. Below Burns, a thin layer of professional and managerial class that the show populates with Springfield's doctors, lawyers, and civic officials. These characters tend to be depicted as incompetent, corrupt, or both. Dr. Nick Riviera, Lionel Hutz, Mayor Quimby. The system's middle managers are as broken as the system itself. Below them, the ordinary residents of Springfield, the people who work at the plant, who own the small businesses, who teach at the school and police the streets and fill the church and populate the bleachers at the baseball stadium. These are the people the show has always understood best, because they are the people the show was made about in the deepest sense. People of ordinary resources navigating extraordinary circumstances, produced by systems they do not control and only partially understand. And below them, or outside the standard hierarchies, the people who have been most thoroughly left behind by Springfield's economic structure. The people living in shelters. The people whose poverty is visible enough that the show acknowledges it but not central enough to its narrative that the show fully reckons with what it implies. The class structure of Springfield is depicted without the comfort of meritocracy. The show does not suggest that the people at the bottom are there because they made different choices than the people above them, or that the people at the top are there because they deserve their position. It depicts the structure, as a thing built and maintained by specific choices made by specific people with specific interests, and it understands that the structure has costs that are distributed unequally across the people inside it. This is one of the ways the show was doing something more sophisticated than comedy from its earliest seasons. The best American sitcoms of the era were careful not to implicate their economic contexts too directly. They operated in a space where the characters' circumstances were accepted as given rather than examined as produced. The Simpsons looked at the economic context of its characters' lives and refused to treat it as a given. It kept asking how they got there, Who made the decisions that determined their position and what it was costing them to stay? The answer, across 36 seasons, has been remarkably consistent. They got there through the accumulated effects of a system that was designed to produce exactly this result. Burns made the decisions, or the decisions were made in Burns's interest by people who depended on his continued goodwill. And the cost is the specific cost of living inside a structure that has redirected the town's collective cognitive energy away from examining the structure and toward managing the day-to-day challenges of life within it. Springfield's institutions are a particular expression of this dynamic. The school system that Bart and Lisa navigate is chronically underfunded, its budget perpetually subject to the priorities of an administration more concerned with the appearances of competence than with the reality of education. The police force, personified by Chief Wiggum, operates with a competence level that the show depicts as comedic, but that, within the town's systemic logic, serves a specific function. A police force that cannot solve crimes is a police force that cannot threaten the people who benefit from certain crimes remaining unsolved. The church provides the town's residents with a framework for managing the anxiety of their circumstances that specifically does not include examining the source of those circumstances. Ned Flanders is the show's most sustained portrait of what religious faith looks like when it functions primarily as an anxiety management tool rather than as a genuine encounter with transcendence. The faith is real. The faith is also, at least in part, functional, in the specific sense that it redirects Ned's considerable internal pressure away from the channels that might produce structural critique and into the channels of forgiveness and patience and trust in a plan that will eventually make sense. God talks to Homer in the show's canon. God has appeared to Homer directly on multiple occasions, has had conversations with him, has offered guidance that Homer has largely ignored but that constituted genuine divine contact in the show's universe. God has never appeared to Ned. Ned, who prays more consistently and with more genuine devotion than any other character in Springfield, has never received the direct engagement that Homer, who mostly seems to bother God by accident, has received multiple times. This is not an argument about theology. It is an argument about Springfield's particular spiritual economics, in which the rewards of institutional faith do not track with the investment of individual devotion. The show knows this and depicts it without commentary, trusting the watching to produce the necessary discomfort. Springfield as a character, then, is a community that has organized itself around the management of a specific kind of collective wound. The wound was inflicted by the plant and sustained by the systems that depend on the plant's continued operation. The management strategies are the episodic resets, the institutional incompetence, the community's demonstrated willingness to choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. And the character that these management strategies have produced, the specific personality of Springfield as a place, is one of the most thoroughly imagined fictional communities in the history of the medium. It is also, with uncomfortable precision, a portrait of a real dynamic that operates in real communities across the real country. The company town that cannot afford to examine the company. The community that has organized its psychology around the maintenance of a denial that is more functional than the alternative. The place that has chosen, collectively and deliberately, to stop asking certain questions because the questions, honestly answered, would require changes that the community's infrastructure cannot support. Springfield is everywhere. Springfield is every town, not because it was designed to be universally relatable, though it was, but because the dynamic it depicts is genuinely universal. The specific version of American community life that the show captured in 1989 and has been annotating ever since is not a cartoon exaggeration of something real. It is a cartoon that knows exactly which aspects of reality to exaggerate to make the real thing visible. Number. Section 8. The Music and the Silence. Alf Clausen scored The Simpsons for 27 years. His name appeared in the credits of 559 episodes before his contract was ended in 2017, replaced by a team of composers working in a different idiom. The change was noticed by fans, discussed with the specific kind of loyalty that attends any change to a long-running show's established texture. But the significance of Clausen's work, the specific thing he was doing across those 559 episodes, was rarely articulated with the precision it deserves. Clausen understood that the score of a comedy is not decoration. In a show that deploys music as frequently and as deliberately as The Simpsons, the score is a second narrative running underneath the spoken one. It can confirm what the images and dialogue are establishing, which is the most basic function. Or it can contradict it, can introduce a register that the spoken surface of the scene is not acknowledging, can tell you something about what is actually happening in a moment that the show's comedy is actively working to conceal. Clausen did both, and the distinction between the two is one of the clearest markers of when the show was being comedy and when it was being something else. The comedy episodes have scores that function as comment and acceleration. The jokes come faster when the music is pushing them, and Clausen's comedy scoring is technically accomplished in the specific ways that television comedy scoring requires. Good timing, good thematic recognition, the ability to land a musical joke at precisely the right moment and then get out of the way before the next spoken joke needs space. But the other episodes, the ones in the previous section's territory, the Homer grief episodes and the Marge suppression episodes and the Lisa saxophone episodes, these have a completely different sonic texture. The score in these moments is slower, more harmonically complex, reaching toward a register that the show's ordinary idiom does not inhabit. And in the best of these episodes, the score is doing something the dialogue cannot quite do, which is naming the emotional reality underneath the spoken surface. The most significant example of Clausen's scoring work is probably not a single episode, but a recurring choice. The choice, made consistently across the show's run, to underscore Lisa's most significant emotional moments with a jazz vocabulary. Not the orchestral vocabulary of the show's comedy scenes, not the pastiche scoring that the show uses for its parody sequences, but genuine jazz harmony and phrasing, complex and often unresolved, reaching toward things that the diatonic simplicity of the comedy's usual musical language cannot reach. This choice has a specific effect. Jazz, as a musical language, carries in the cultural consciousness an association with a particular kind of interiority, with the experience of holding complexity, of navigating tension that does not resolve cleanly, of finding beauty in dissonance rather than despite it. By scoring Lisa's interior life in jazz, Clausen was not just providing atmospheric appropriateness to a character who plays the saxophone. He was making a statement about the quality of Lisa's experience, about the register in which her inner life operates, about the relationship between her intelligence and her isolation, and the specific beauty that this combination produces. The saxophone themes that recur across Lisa's episodes are not decorative, they are diagnostic. They tell you, in musical terms, what the spoken scenes are not equipped to say. And the choice to place them in a jazz idiom means that they are also, for any viewer with even a passing familiarity with that musical tradition, resonant with the specific history of a music that was born from the experience of people whose full humanity was not being acknowledged by the dominant culture around them. This is not an accidental association. The show's jazz scoring for Lisa is not incidentally in a jazz idiom. It is specifically in a jazz idiom, and the choice carries the weight of that specificity. Silence is the other significant musical tool the show employs. The Simpsons is not a quiet show. It is dense with sound, with dialogue and comedy beats and score, and the specific ambient texture of a show that was produced in the tradition of the classic Hollywood comedies that understood pace as a narrative tool. The silence, when it comes, is conspicuous. The most famous use of silence in the show's history is probably the ending of Mother Simpson. Homer, on the hood of his car in the dark, looking up at the sky. The music stops. The scene holds. Then the credits roll over it. The silence at the end of that episode is doing something that speech or score could not do. It is creating space for the viewer's own emotional processing, acknowledging that what has just happened requires more room than the show's usual sonic density allows. There are other silences, less famous but equally precise. The moment after Marge's gambling problem is addressed, when the family sits together and the ordinary noise of the household has not yet resumed, and something is visible on Marge's face that the comedy usually conceals. The moment after Bart fails, again at something the school has decided matters, when the camera holds on him long enough that the failure stops being funny and starts being something sadder. The moment after Lisa plays the saxophone, and the last note fades and the scene is about to continue but has not yet continued, and the silence between the note and the next spoken word contains everything the note was trying to say. Clausen's successors are competent. The post-2017 scoring of the show is professionally executed in the idiom of contemporary television comedy scoring. But it is not doing the second narrative. It is not providing the register underneath the register. It is confirming what the images and dialogue establish, which is the basic function, and it is doing that function well. The loss of the second narrative is one of the reasons the later seasons feel slightly less dimensional. Not because the scripts are necessarily worse, though the scripts are often different in character from the show's peak seasons, but because the musical texture that was doing a significant portion of the show's emotional work, quietly, beneath the comedy, is no longer providing that work, and the absence is felt as a flatness, a reduction in the number of frequencies the show is transmitting simultaneously. The Danny Elfman theme deserves its own consideration. The opening credits sequence, with its specific mixture of domestic imagery and escalating speed, and the finally landed couch gag, is one of the most recognizable 30 seconds in the history of American television. Elfman's theme is not comedy music. It is something stranger, something that sits at the intersection of wonder and anxiety and movement, a musical statement about a family in motion through a world that is slightly too large and too fast for comfort. The theme has never changed in its fundamental character across 36 seasons. Its tempo has been adjusted, its orchestration has been updated, but the emotional proposition of it, the feeling it communicates before a single word of dialogue has been spoken, has remained consistent. Something about this family, this house, this town, this show, is going to be both familiar and slightly off-kilter, both safe and vertiginous, both home and somewhere strange. That is an accurate summary of the show's entire emotional project, captured in 30 seconds of music before the episode begins. The theme told you what you were watching. The comedy told you to stop worrying about it. And the Clausen scores, for 27 years, kept quietly insisting that there was still something worth worrying about, underneath the jokes, in the register that the jokes were designed not to disturb. Number. Section 9. The Treehouse of Horror as Truth-Telling. Every year, usually in late October, The Simpsons releases itself from the constraints of its own continuity and tells you the truth. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, annual anthology specials that have been a fixture of the show since Season 2, operate under a different contract than the regular episodes. The regular episodes are bound by the floating timeline, by the characters' established positions, by the show's fundamental commitment to returning everything to the status quo by the time the credits roll. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are bound by none of this. Characters die. The world ends. Family members betray and destroy each other. The darkest possible versions of each character's psychology are taken to their logical conclusions, and nobody has to wake up next week pretending it did not happen. This is presented always as license for horror comedy. The genre framing, the horror anthology structure, the Halloween timing, all of it communicates that what you are about to watch is safely fictionalized, twice removed from the show's ordinary reality. Horror as entertainment, not horror as diagnostic. But the Treehouse of Horror episodes keep saying things about the characters that the regular episodes can only approach obliquely. They say these things in the language of horror, which is itself a language specifically designed for approaching the things that cannot be approached directly. Horror is the genre that processes fears too large or too specific to be addressed in ordinary narrative discourse. The monster is always a displacement. The thing you are afraid of is never quite the monster. The Treehouse of Horror segments that have endured most durably in the cultural memory are not the ones with the most elaborate horror mechanics. They are the ones where the horror premise most precisely illuminates something about the character at its center. Homer in the Parallel Dimension segment, from Treehouse of Horror 6, is the clearest example. Homer discovers a portal into a three-dimensional world, a realm that the episode renders in an early computer graphics style that was both technically impressive for its time and deliberately uncanny in its quality. He enters and becomes trapped in this between space, this dimension that is neither the two-dimensional Springfield he knows, nor the real world he has never had access to, and he wanders through it with the specific bewilderment of a man confronting something that his cognitive tools are not equipped to process. The horror of the segment is formally about the uncanniness of the three-dimensional world. But Homer's experience in it, the specific quality of his confusion and his fear and his sustained inability to understand what has happened to him, maps precisely onto something the regular episodes approach but cannot quite say. Homer lives in a world he does not fully understand. He moves through systems, social, economic, institutional, that his intelligence is not adequate to parse in their full complexity. He is always, in some sense, in the three-dimensional world. always slightly lost in a space that the people around him navigate with more confidence. The horror segment makes this literal. It gives the emotional experience a physical correlate and lets you watch Homer inhabit it for a few minutes, fully exposed, without the comedy's usual mechanisms for softening the exposure. The recurring segment premise of the family killing each other in various configurations across multiple Treehouse of Horror episodes is doing something similar. The family's relationships are loving but also fraught, complicated by the specific pressures of their circumstances and the specific damage each member carries. The regular episodes circle this fraughtness carefully, acknowledging it without dwelling on it, allowing it to surface briefly before the comedy reasserts itself. The horror anthology format removes the restraint. It lets the fraught dimensions of the relationships play out to their conclusions, which in horror means violence, which in turn means something legible and external that can be processed as genre rather than as a direct statement about the family. Homer killing Marge, or Bart killing Homer, or the children turning against the parents, these premises do not survive contact with the regular episode's emotional constraints. They cannot be held within the show's fundamental premise of a family that loves each other and persists together. But in the Treehouse of Horror space, they can be explored. The fear can be given physical form and played out and resolved within the 40-minute sandbox of the anthology, and then the next regular episode can pretend it never happened. Except it did happen. It was seen. The fear was articulated in the language of horror, and the audience received it, and what they received was a statement about the family that the comedy format cannot make directly, that love and fear coexist in families, that the people you love most are also, in specific and nameable ways, sources of fear, that the sustained intimacy of family life produces pressures that the show's ordinary emotional vocabulary is not equipped to hold. The horror genre is equipped to hold them. That is why the Treehouse of Horror format has been running annually since Season 2. Not primarily because it is a successful commercial property, though it is, but because the show needs a space where it can say the things that the comedy format, for all its sophistication, cannot contain. The segments that adapt existing horror properties, the Shining parody, the Poe readings, the various monster movie recreations, these are the segments where the show is most visibly playing, where the genre framing is foregrounded and the emotional subtext is less urgent. But even these segments have a subtext. The Shining parody, which puts Homer in the position of a man isolated with his family in a vast space, slowly losing his mind as the institution he is supposed to be maintaining, decays around him, and the supernatural pressures of the space operate on his already compromised psychology, is not just a parody of The Shining. It is a portrait of Homer's general situation in which the horror elements are not exaggerations but direct statements. Homer is isolated with his family. Homer is slowly losing his mind, or has already lost a significant portion of it. Homer is supposedly maintaining a facility, the nuclear plant, that is decaying around him, and the pressures operating on him, environmental, economic, psychological, are not supernatural in the literal sense but are, in the emotional sense, precisely as overwhelming as the supernatural pressures operating on Jack Torrance. The Treehouse of Horror knows this. It puts Homer in the Shining parody because the structural similarity between his situation and Torrance's is not accidental and not purely comedic. It is diagnostic. The horror genre, applied to Homer's life, reveals the horror that the comedy genre, applied to the same life, has been carefully managing for 36 years. The annual Treehouse of Horror is the show's pressure release valve. It is the place where the accumulated pressure of the show's real emotional content, the grief and the loneliness and the institutional failure and the systematic damage and the love that is always in some relationship with fear, gets to express itself without constraint. And then the valve closes and the comedy resumes and everything goes back to normal. But the expression was real. The thing said in the horror format was true. The show was telling you something it could not tell you directly, and it was trusting you to receive it in the register in which it was delivered, which is the register of things too large and too true for ordinary daylight discourse. Horror is how we tell those things. The Simpsons understood this from the beginning. The Treehouse of Horror is not a departure from the show's central project. It is the show's central project, released from its usual constraints for one episode per season, allowed to be as honest as the rest of the year's episodes cannot quite be. Number. Section 10, The Guest Stars and What They Revealed. The Simpsons has hosted more celebrity guest appearances than any other show in television history. The list is so long that comprehensive accounting of it would take longer than most films. Presidents, musicians, scientists, athletes, actors, directors, writers, philosophers, Nobel laureates. The full spectrum of public achievement and public recognition, filtered through Springfield, processed by the show's particular sensibility, and released into episodes that use these appearances in ways that the guests themselves did not always fully anticipate. The guest star tradition of The Simpsons began in the first season and has never stopped. But the nature of the guest appearances changed significantly across the show's arc, and tracking that change reveals something about both the show's evolving relationship with celebrity culture and the specific function that celebrity visits to Springfield were always serving. The early guest appearances, from the first several seasons, tended to be people playing versions of themselves in situations that commented on their public personas. Michael Jackson's appearance in Season 3, in which he played a large white mental patient who claimed to be Michael Jackson and who turned out to be exactly who he claimed to be, is the canonical example. The appearance is specifically about the relationship between celebrity and the performance of celebrity, about what it means to be Michael Jackson in a world where being Michael Jackson is simultaneously everything and not enough. What makes the early appearances significant, beyond their individual quality, is the way they use the Springfield setting to strip their subjects of the protective layer of their celebrity. When a famous person visits Springfield, the town does not know how to treat them. Springfield is not equipped with the usual apparatus of celebrity deference. The residents of Springfield have genuine, sometimes embarrassing reactions to famous people, reactions that do not observe the usual social protocols around celebrity, and these genuine reactions have the effect of exposing the celebrity to a kind of honesty that their normal environment does not provide. The famous person comes to Springfield, and Springfield treats them, at least partly, like a person. This is disorienting and occasionally cruel and occasionally tender and always revealing, because the thing that celebrity protects the famous person from is exactly the thing Springfield inflicts on them. Direct, unmediated, socially unfiltered human response. The coma theory, which suggests that the celebrity appearances in later seasons represent Homer's unconscious mind processing fragments of media received through the fog of unconsciousness, offers a specific reading of why the guest appearances become more frequent and more surreal as the seasons progress. But there is another reading available, one that does not require the coma premise to function. The guest appearances become more frequent in later seasons because the show's relationship with its own cultural position changes as it ages. In the early seasons, The Simpsons is the cultural insurgent. It is the thing challenging the established order of American television comedy. It is not desperate for the validation of famous people. It uses them as raw material. In the later seasons, The Simpsons is itself an institution. It is the established cultural monument. And the specific question that this institutional status raises, the question of whether a show can maintain its satirical relationship with cultural power when it has itself become a form of cultural power, begins to be addressed through the guest appearances. When a celebrity appears in a later season of The Simpsons, they are not simply visiting a cartoon town, they are visiting a monument. They are lending their own cultural weight to something that already has more cultural weight than almost anything else in American television history, and the show is self-aware about this. The later guest appearances frequently carry a quality of meta-commentary, of the show acknowledging its own institutional weight and the specific complications that weight creates. The most significant guest appearances are not the most famous ones. They are the ones where the person appearing brings something specific to the episode that illuminates something about the show's own relationship with the passage of time and the question of cultural relevance. The musicians who have appeared on the show offer a particular version of this dynamic. Musicians exist in a specific relationship with cultural time that other kinds of celebrity do not. A musician's work is tied to a particular sonic moment, and as that moment recedes into history, the relationship between the musician and their contemporary audience changes. They become, in a specific sense, ambassadors from the past, people whose relevance was established in one cultural moment and who exist in subsequent cultural moments as representatives of what that earlier moment felt like. Springfield is full of cultural ambassadors from the past. The town is built on a floating timeline, which means that it is always, simultaneously, in the cultural moment of its original broadcast and in the cultural moment of each subsequent episode's broadcast. It exists in a kind of temporal compression that makes it uniquely hospitable to artists whose cultural position has a similar quality of temporal compression. The musician who was famous when the show began and who remains famous enough to be referenced 30 years later is essentially in the same temporal position as Springfield itself. The scientist guests represent something different. The Stephen Hawking appearances, the presence of Nobel laureates and public intellectuals in episodes across the show's run, these appearances are about Springfield's relationship with intelligence and expertise. Springfield has a complicated relationship with expertise. The town's residents are, as the radiation theory and the coma theory and several other frameworks have suggested, cognitively compromised in various ways. Their relationship with expert knowledge is therefore ambivalent. They need it in the specific sense that intelligent management of their circumstances would require the kind of specialized knowledge that scientists and doctors and engineers possess. But they also distrust it, in the specific sense that expert knowledge has historically been the tool used to manage rather than to empower the people at Springfield's economic level. When a scientist visits Springfield, they are visiting a community that wants to believe in expertise but has learned, through repeated experience, that expertise serves the interests of the people who employ the experts. The guest scientist is therefore always in a slightly uncomfortable position, welcomed as an individual and regarded with ambivalence as a representative of the institutions from which they come. The athlete appearances follow their own logic, which is more directly comedic but not without subtext. Springfield's relationship with sports is the relationship of a working-class community with the entertainment it uses to manage collective anxiety. Sports in Springfield function as the show described them in the episode Homer at the Bat, where Burns assembles a professional baseball team to win a company softball championship, which is to say, as a system that appears to be about community and excellence, but is actually about institutional interest and the management of the people who generate that interest. The athletes who appear in Springfield are therefore always, at some level, characters in a story about who sports are for and who they are not for. The actor appearances are the most reflexive. When an actor appears in Springfield, the show is aware of the specific doubling that this creates, the awareness that the actor is a person who performs other people for a living appearing in a show whose central conceit is that its characters are people, and the interesting question of where the performance is and where the person is in that specific configuration. The show has never resolved this question. It has used it. The best actor appearances in the show's history are the ones where the complexity of the doubling is allowed to be part of the episode's texture, where the question of authenticity and performance is foregrounded in the story the episode is telling. What all of the guest appearances share, across every category and every era of the show, is the function of putting Springfield's particular reality in contact with the broader reality that it both reflects and satirizes. Every person who walks into Springfield from outside its borders, whose skin is not yellow, whose eyes are not bulging, whose four fingers are not the four fingers of a town that has been chemically altered and is collectively refusing to notice, is a data point, a comparison, a reference that makes visible, through contrast, exactly how strange the conditions inside Springfield actually are. The guests do not stay. They visit and they leave, and Springfield continues. The yellow and the four fingers and the cracked cooling towers and the floating timeline all persisting after the guest's departure, unchanged by the contact with something external. This is the show's most precise use of the guest appearance format, not for the comedy of famous people in absurd situations, though that comedy is real, but for the contrast. For the way that the presence of someone from outside the contamination zone, someone whose eyes are the right shape and whose skin is not the color of a traffic warning, makes visible by comparison what the people inside the zone look like to a world that has not normalized the specific conditions of their existence. Number. Section 11. The final seasons and the question of dignity. There is a conversation that has been happening in the margins of Simpsons fandom for approximately 20 years. It takes place in internet forums and in casual exchanges between people who have been watching the show since childhood. It does not have a consensus resolution. It does not have a clear start date, but it has a recognizable shape, and the shape of it is the question: when did the show stop being good, and what does it mean that it kept going anyway? The question is usually framed as a quality assessment. The early seasons, defined differently by different people but generally coalescing around the first 8 or 9, are the gold standard. The episodes of this period are technically accomplished. emotionally sophisticated, built on premises that reflect genuine understanding of the characters and genuine investment in what the show was trying to say. They age well. They can be watched by people who were not born when they were produced and received as fully functional art. The later seasons are also received as fully functional art by the people for whom they are formative. The children who grew up watching seasons 15 through 20 do not experience those seasons as lesser. They experience them as their Simpsons, the specific version of the show that shaped their relationship with it, and the nostalgia they carry for those seasons is as real and as legitimate as the nostalgia the earlier fans carry for theirs. But the conversation about quality is not really about nostalgia. It is about something else. Something the show itself has been negotiating for at least 2 decades. The question of dignity. A show that began as a precise and sophisticated piece of cultural criticism that spent its peak years doing something genuinely unprecedented in the medium, eventually has to reckon with its own institutional status. The insurgent becomes the establishment. The critique becomes the thing being critiqued. The show that built its initial identity on being the outsider's view of American culture becomes the dominant institution of American television, comedy, and the specific challenge of maintaining an outsider's perspective from inside the largest house on the block is a challenge the show has never fully resolved. The dignity question is about whether a show that has produced work of genuine artistic significance has an obligation to a standard of continued care, and what happens when the commercial pressures of continued production outpace the creative resources available to meet that obligation. The Simpsons has been renewed through season 36, with season 37 in production. This is not a creative decision, it is a commercial one. The show generates significant revenue for its network, and the network has made the calculation that continued production is economically preferable to ending, regardless of the creative consequences of that calculation. This is not a unique situation in American television history, but it is one that is rarely handled with the specific kind of honesty that the situation deserves. Most long-running shows simply continue, and the audience calibrates its expectations accordingly. And the conversation about quality happens in the margins where the audience talks to itself, and the show continues to be renewed. The Simpsons has been unusual in its willingness, at specific moments and in specific episodes, to engage with the question of its own continued existence and the specific creative challenges of being a show that has been running for 36 years. The meta-textual episodes, the episodes that fold the show's production context into their narrative content, are the clearest examples of this engagement. The episode that most directly addresses the quality question is Behind the Laughter, the season 11 mockumentary that depicts the Simpson family as real people who star in a television show about their family. The premise allows the show to comment on its own production history, its own creative evolution, its own relationship with the commercial pressures that have shaped it. The episode is funny in the specific ways that meta-commentary can be funny. But it is also, underneath the comedy, a genuine reckoning with what 36 seasons of continuous production costs. The show's peak was a specific and unrepeatable combination of creative conditions. A writing room that was assembled at a specific moment, with a specific chemistry, in a specific cultural context, producing work that reflected the convergence of all those specific conditions. That moment passed, as all such moments do. The people who produced it moved on to other projects, or moved into different roles within the show, or simply changed in the ways that people change across decades of a career. The conditions that produced the peak could not be sustained indefinitely, because no conditions can be sustained indefinitely. What the show has done in its later seasons, the choice that the dignity question centers on, is to continue producing episodes. Hundreds of them. Many of these episodes are good television by any reasonable standard. They are entertaining, they are technically competent, they are produced with genuine craft. But they are not, for the most part, the thing that the show was during its peak. They are not doing the second narrative. They are not deploying the Clausen score to say things the dialogue cannot. They are not landing the emotional gut punches of Mother Simpson or Lisa's wedding with the same precision and the same apparent genuine investment. The question of whether this represents a failure of dignity or simply the inevitable evolution of a long-running show is not a question with a clean answer. It is a question about what we expect from cultural institutions, and whether those expectations are reasonable, and whether the work produced in the later phases of a long career can or should be evaluated against the work produced at the peak. The earlier seasons of the show had something that the later seasons have largely lost: not the quality of individual jokes, which remains high, not the animation or the vocal performances or the technical infrastructure of the show's production. What they had was urgency, the sense that the show was making these specific episodes because it had something specific to say and that the saying of it mattered. The later seasons have the infrastructure of the show, but not always the urgency. They are produced by people who care about the work and bring genuine skill to it, but who are also producing it within a commercial context that requires a certain volume of output, and the volume is not always compatible with the urgency. This is the honest assessment. The show has not entirely lost what made it great. There are individual episodes in even the most recent seasons that achieve something real, that access the emotional register of the peak work and produce moments of genuine impact. The show has not become bad. It has become something more complicated, a monument to its own peak, producing competent work in the shadow of extraordinary work, negotiating the specific dignity question of whether continued existence serves the legacy or gradually rewrites it. The fans who are still watching, and there are many of them, are watching with a specific kind of loyalty that the earlier seasons earned and the later seasons benefit from. They are watching because the early work built a relationship with the show that extended beyond any individual episode, that made the show itself, as an ongoing entity, an object of genuine attachment. They are watching because walking away would feel like a different kind of loss than the gradual quality decline is producing, because the loss of the relationship is worse than the disappointment of the episodes, and human beings generally choose the familiar disappointment over the clean break. The show will eventually end. It must end, because everything does. And the ending will produce a specific kind of cultural moment that has not yet been fully imagined, because the show has been running for so long that it has become part of the environmental furniture of American culture in a way that makes its ending difficult to model. What happens to a town that has been in your peripheral vision for your entire life when the town goes away? What happens to the floating timeline when the float is finally over and the timeline has to land somewhere? The final episode of The Simpsons, whenever it comes, will be one of the most significant cultural events in the history of American television. Not because the show is currently in its peak form, because it is not, but because of what the show's long existence has accumulated. 36 seasons of returning to the same family, the same town, the same cracked cooling towers and floating timeline and impossible blue hair, has created a relationship between the show and its audience that goes beyond entertainment. It has become something closer to a shared mythology, a story that enough people hold in common that its ending will be experienced as something more like a loss than a cancellation. The dignity question, in the end, is not really about quality. It is about love. The show has been loved across 36 seasons with the specific intensity that only very long relationships can generate. The love is real regardless of whether every episode deserves it. The love is the consequence of the early season's extraordinary achievement, sustained across decades of continued presence even when the achievement was not always matched. What the show owes that love is the honest question. What the audience owes the show in return is a quieter one. Perhaps only this: to keep watching with the same attention that the early seasons trained us to bring. To notice when something real is still being said, in whatever season it appears. To not mistake the familiar for the comfortable, or the comfortable for the good. The show has always been more than comfortable. Even in its worst episodes, even in the seasons furthest from the peak, the family at its center carries the emotional truth that the peak seasons established. Homer still loves his family with the desperation of a man who lost his mother before he understood what losing meant. Marge still carries, behind the blue tower and the patient composure, the valedictorian who went somewhere else. Bart still refuses to pretend the system is working when the system is clearly not. Lisa still plays the saxophone in the register of things too complex for the town around her to hold. And Maggie still watches everything with the expression of someone who understands far more than she is saying. The family is still there. The grief architecture is still there. The loneliness engine is still running. The invisible collapse is still happening in the spaces between the comedy. The show is still saying what it has always been saying, about ordinary people carrying extraordinary damage in a town that chose the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth and will keep choosing it as long as the power plant keeps running. That is the show. That is what 36 seasons have accumulated. And whether any individual episode is great or merely competent, the accumulation itself is something that only the most extraordinary runs in television history have been able to produce. The dignity is in the accumulation. The dignity is in the fact that Homer is still on the couch, and Marge is still sighing, and Bart is still in detention, and Lisa is still playing, and Maggie is still silent, and Springfield is still yellow, and nobody has asked why. The dignity is in the asking of why, which is what we have been doing for the last several sections, and what the show has been inviting since December 17th, 1989. Number. Section 12. Why it was never a comedy. We have spent a great deal of time in Springfield now. Long enough to have moved past the couch gag and the laugh track and the cultural shorthand of Homer saying his catchphrase and Bart writing his punishment on the chalkboard. Long enough to be in the part of the town where the jokes are visible as architecture rather than as the point. And what the architecture is holding up has become the subject. The argument has been assembled across the previous 11 sections. It is time to put it together plainly. The Simpsons was not a comedy. It was never primarily a comedy, in the way that something is primarily a comedy when comedy is the load-bearing material of the construction, the thing the whole structure is built from, rather than the thing that holds the other material together. The jokes were real. The comedy was accomplished. The technical achievement of the show's humor, across its peak seasons especially, is documented and undeniable and represents one of the genuine creative pinnacles in the history of the medium. None of this is being disputed. The argument is not that the show was bad comedy. The argument is that the comedy was not the point. The point was always the family, the specific texture of this family, assembled from grief and longing and suppressed intelligence and refused compliance and impossible silence, living in this specific town at this specific economic level, under the shadow of this specific cracked cooling tower. The family was the subject. The comedy was the way the show held the subject, the way it made the subject available to an audience that might not have been willing to look at it directly. This is a specific thing that comedy can do, and that no other genre does as well. It can approach unbearable things obliquely, from an angle that softens the direct confrontation without eliminating the content of what is being approached. The comedy in The Simpsons was the oblique angle. The grief and the loneliness and the institutional failure and the systematic damage were the content. The combination was the show. What the 36-season duration of the show reveals, what only a run of this length could reveal, is how durable the content was and how temporary the obliqueness was. The comedy, across the decades, has become familiar. The timing and the references and the recurring gags are known quantities. And the brain, which is very good at pattern recognition, stops processing familiar patterns with the same attention it brings to new information. The comedy becomes wallpaper. But the content underneath does not become wallpaper. The content underneath has a quality that prevents it from receding into familiarity, because the content is about things that do not recede. Grief does not become wallpaper. Loneliness does not. The specific weight of being a person who cannot quite be understood by the world they live in does not. These things maintain their texture across decades of repeated exposure because they are not about this specific comedy or this specific show. They are about the specific conditions of human life, and the specific conditions of human life do not age the way jokes do. This is why the show's emotional moments, the Mother Simpson ending and the Lisa saxophone playing, and the Homer on the car hood in the dark, and the Marge sitting alone in the quiet house, why these moments have maintained their power across 36 years, while many of the comedy sequences from the same era have become the specific artifacts of their original moment. The emotional moments are not in a relationship with their time the way the comedic moments are. They are in a relationship with the audience's humanity, which is not time-specific. The show understood this from very early in its run, which is why the emotional moments were placed inside the comedy so carefully, protected by the comedy, delivered in the spaces between the jokes where the audience had been softened by laughter into a condition of receptivity they would not otherwise have maintained. The comedy made the emotion accessible. But the emotion was always the thing. Consider what the show would have been without the comedy. Consider the emotional content assembled across the sections of this script, the grief architecture and the invisible collapse and the loneliness engine and the secondary characters carrying their specific weights, installed in a drama? A prestige drama of the kind that television has been producing for the past 2 decades with serious critical attention and award season investment. In that format, the show would be recognizable as serious art immediately. The conversation about it would be different. The cultural position it occupied would be different. But it would not have the reach. It would not have the 36 seasons. It would not have the hundreds of millions of people who encountered it in childhood and carried it forward into their adult lives, who use it as a shared reference, who return to it in moments of comfort or stress, who have relationships with these characters that function like relationships with real people, in the specific sense that the characters have been present for long enough to be part of the emotional furniture of a life. The comedy made the reach possible. The comedy was the mechanism by which the show's genuine emotional and social content was delivered to an audience that, without the comedy, would not have sought it out. This is the most significant thing about the show's formal choice. Not that comedy is a lesser genre, but that comedy, in this specific deployment, was doing something that requires the comedy's specific affordances to accomplish. You cannot deliver this particular content to this particular audience in any other form and maintain the relationship across 36 years. The comedy is what made the relationship possible. The relationship is what made the content transmissible. The content is what made the relationship worth maintaining. The show's failure mode in its later seasons is not a failure of comedy. The individual comedic elements of the later seasons are often quite good. The failure mode is a loss of connection between the comedy and the content, a loosening of the relationship between the surface the show is presenting and the substrate the surface is supposed to be managing. The comedy continues. The emotional content becomes less consistently present or less consistently connected to the comedy in the specific way that the peak seasons established. This is the difference between the show at its best and the show in its later phase. At its best, the comedy and the content are inseparable. The joke lands, and in landing it opens a door into something real. And the real thing is available for the fraction of a second before the next joke closes the door. In the later seasons, the jokes land without opening doors. They are complete in themselves, self-contained comedy, professionally executed. But they are no longer doing the second function. The Simpsons at its best was never primarily a comedy. At its best, it was a work of sustained social and emotional observation using comedy as its delivery mechanism. The delivery mechanism was excellent. The observation was extraordinary, and the combination produced something that the history of the medium had not seen before and has not seen again, because the specific conditions that produced it, the specific convergence of creative talent and cultural moment and commercial context and formal innovation, have not been replicated. 36 seasons, 788 episodes, the longest-running American animated series in history, the longest-running sitcom, the longest-running scripted primetime show in the history of American television. And in all that time, across every one of those episodes, the show was doing something that the category it was placed in could not quite contain. It was observing. Precisely, consistently, with genuine care and genuine knowledge, it was observing the specific conditions of ordinary American life. The economic anxiety, the institutional failure, the accumulated damage done to people by systems that were not designed with their flourishing at the center. The specific quality of love that grows in damaged conditions, which is not a lesser love for being damaged, but is a love shaped by the damage, carrying the shape of the wound in the shape of the attachment. Homer loves his family with the shape of maternal abandonment and cognitive limitation, and 30 years in a job he did not choose. Marge loves her family with the shape of the valedictorian who went somewhere else and watches the someone else she became, with a patience that is very close to the patience you need to carry something you cannot put down. Bart loves his family with the shape of a kid who was told from birth that he was a problem and who has spent his entire life being a problem on purpose, because at least that is choosing the narrative rather than accepting it. Lisa loves her family with the shape of someone who sees them clearly, more clearly than they see themselves, and loves them anyway, which is the hardest kind. And Maggie loves them in silence, from behind the pacifier and the enormous eyes and the careful checking of surroundings, before any genuine expression of the interior is allowed. Maggie loves them with the shape of someone who has decided that love does not require announcement, that presence is the deepest form of devotion, that the watching and the understanding and the occasional, devastating act of rescue are enough. This is the family, this is the show, this is what the comedy was holding. What the 36 seasons were accumulating, what the yellow skin and the floating timeline and the cracked cooling towers were, all of them symptoms of a portrait of ordinary people living in extraordinary circumstances, loving each other with the specific shapes their damage gave them, in a town that was never going to save them and that they were never going to leave, on a couch in front of a television in a house on Evergreen Terrace, in the town of Springfield, in a state that shifts depending on which episode you are watching. in an America that the show was depicting with more honesty than almost any other piece of American television has ever managed to bring to the subject. It was never a comedy. It was always the truest thing the medium has produced. The comedy was the form that truth took because the form made the truth survivable. Every Sunday evening for 36 years, the truth survived. The family persisted, the couch held them, the television played, the credits rolled, and the yellow skin caught the light in every frame. A warning the town chose not to read, in the specific colors of a place that had decided to survive rather than to understand, which is the choice that most places make, which is the choice that most of us, in our own versions of Springfield, in the quiet moments after the comedy has finished and the real work of being a person resumes, recognize without quite naming. We are Springfield. We have always been Springfield. We built the couch and we sat on it and we laughed at the family on the screen, and somewhere in the laughter, if we were paying attention, we were also crying for them. For Homer on the car hood in the dark, for Marge in the kitchen in the quiet, for Bart in the principal's office refusing again, for Lisa behind the glass wall, reaching again, for Maggie watching all of it with that enormous intelligence behind those enormous eyes, waiting, still, for the right moment to speak. She has been waiting for 36 years. Maybe she is waiting for the same moment we are. The moment we stop laughing long enough to ask the question that has been available to us since the first frame of the first episode, in the color of every person in every scene of a town that was never a comedy. Why are they yellow? What happened to these people? Why has nobody ever stopped to ask? The answer is that they could not ask. The system made sure of that. The plant and the crayon and the denial and the vote to criminalize the truth, all of it working together to ensure that the question would never quite surface, that the asking would always be deferred, that the comfortable lie would always be chosen over the uncomfortable truth, because the comfortable lie was cheaper and the uncomfortable truth was more than the town's infrastructure could support. But we can ask. We have always been able to ask. The show was always asking, in the language of yellow skin and impossible hair, and a man sleeping at a nuclear reactor, and a baby who shot the richest man in town, and a dog with the same mutated eyes as its owners. The show was always asking. We just had to stop laughing long enough to hear the question underneath the joke. And the question, heard clearly, after 36 seasons of accumulation, is not small. It is not a conspiracy theory or a fan theory or a reading imposed from outside. It is the show's actual subject, stated plainly in every frame, available to anyone who is willing to look past the comedy at what the comedy is holding. The Simpsons is the story of a family that was broken before it had the chance to be whole, living in a town that chose its brokenness over the alternative, in a country that sees something of itself in both the family and the town, and keeps coming back, every Sunday evening, to confirm that yes, this is still here, the couch is still there, the family is still on it, and nobody has left and nobody has aged and nobody has asked the question that has been written in yellow, in every frame, for 36 years. We keep coming back because that is what love looks like when it has nowhere else to go. When the comfortable lie is the only version of the truth that is survivable. When the couch is the whole world and the world is enough because it has to be because there is no other. The family is still on the couch, the show is still running, the cooling towers are still cracked, the water is still the color it has always been. And Homer is still at the plant and Marge is still in the kitchen, and Bart is still in detention, and Lisa is still playing, and Maggie is still watching. Waiting. The same way we are waiting. For the moment that might never come. The moment when the question surfaces and the asking begins, and the town finally, after 36 years, looks at its own reflection and asks what it is looking at. It has not come yet. It may not come. Springfield has been very good, for a very long time, at not asking. And we have been very good, watching from our own Springfields, at not asking alongside them. But the question is there. It has always been there. In every frame of every episode, in the color that covers every person in this town, in the silence of the baby with the enormous eyes, in the jazz phrasing that rises above the ordinary noise of a town that was built to produce ordinary noise and nothing else. The question is there. And so, eventually, is the answer. It is in the yellow. It has always been in the yellow. And when you see it, really see it, for the first time or the 100th, the show stops being a comedy and becomes what it always was. A document. An act of love. A warning written in the only color that could carry both meanings simultaneously. The color of caution. The color of Springfield. The color of 36 years of truth dressed in the clothing of entertainment, waiting for an audience patient enough to look past the clothes. We have been that audience. We are still that audience. The couch holds us all. And the family, yellow and impossible and damaged and loving, is still there when we look. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If any part of this found you at the right moment, leave a comment. And if you want more, you know what to do. Number. Section 13. The economics of Evergreen Terrace. There is a specific kind of tension that runs through every episode of The Simpsons that is set inside the house at 742 Evergreen Terrace, and it is a tension that the show has been careful never to name directly. It exists in the gap between the way the house looks and the way the household runs, between the physical space of the home, which is comfortable and spacious in the way that American television homes tend to be, full of rooms and furniture and the ambient suggestion of domestic security, and the economic reality of a family living on a single income from a job that a man with an IQ of 55 has been performing below minimum competency for 3 decades. The economics of the Simpson household are the economics of most American households, not the specific numbers, which would need to be adjusted for Springfield's particular cost of living context, but the specific shape of the relationship between income and expenditure and anxiety, the way that money is always present as a concern even in the episodes where money is not the subject, the way that Homer's employment is never simply employment but is also the entire structural foundation of the family's ability to exist in the configuration they exist in. Homer has been employed at the Springfield nuclear power plant for the entire run of the show. In that time, he has held dozens of other jobs, often simultaneously or in rapid succession, most of them lasting exactly 1 episode before the reset returns him to the plant. He has been a food critic and a bowling alley owner, and a bodyguard and a trucker, and a grease reseller, and a public health inspector, and approximately 90 other occupational identities. But he always comes back to the plant, because the plant is the thing that makes the rest possible. And the rest, the house and the car and the healthcare and the food, and the periodic special occasions that the show depicts with a warmth that acknowledges they cost something, depends on the plant being there. This is the economic reality that the show depicts with remarkable accuracy. The American family of the 1980s and 90s that the show was drawing from was a family that had recently experienced a significant shift in the conditions of its economic life. The period in which the show was conceived and launched was a period of sustained economic change in the United States, change that affected working and middle-class families in ways that were being felt but not yet fully articulated. The manufacturing base that had provided the economic foundation for families like The Simpsons was contracting. The institutional loyalty between employer and employee that had made long-term employment at a single company a reasonable expectation was being replaced by something more transactional. The social contracts that had made a single income sufficient for the lifestyle the show depicts were being revised in ways that would not be fully visible until the following decade. The show placed a nuclear power plant at the center of Springfield's economic life, and placed Homer at the center of the plant's safety infrastructure, and made Homer the man with the 55 IQ and the crayon in his brain. And in doing so, it created a portrait of working-class American economic life that was simultaneously satirical and documentary. The satire was in the extremity of the incompetence. The documentary was in the economic structure underneath it. Homer is not at the plant because he chose it. He is at the plant because the plant is what was available and what remains available. Because the system that was supposed to provide alternatives did not provide them. Because the economic conditions of Springfield ensure that people like Homer do not have the mobility or the leverage to demand better, and because Burns has arranged specifically to make sure that Homer remains exactly where Burns needs him. The deal with Abe, the contractual guarantee of Homer's continued employment regardless of his performance, is not a kindness. It is a management strategy. A man who cannot be fired cannot be replaced by a man who would do the job correctly. The economics of Evergreen Terrace are the economics of a family living inside a system specifically designed to keep them exactly where they are. They are not poor, not in the absolute sense. They have the house and the car and the food and the occasional holiday. But they are perpetually at the edge of their means, in the specific way that working-class American families with 1 income and 3 children have always been at the edge of their means, and the show depicts this edge with the honesty that comes from genuine knowledge of what that edge feels like. The moments when the economics become visible in the show are the moments that tend to hit hardest. When Homer discovers he cannot afford to send Lisa to the school she deserves, when the family faces a medical bill that the show depicts with a matter-of-fact accuracy that does not invite jokes, when Marge does the household accounting at the kitchen table with the same patient care she brings to everything, and the numbers do not quite reach, and she adjusts without explanation or complaint, because adjustment is what the situation requires. These moments are not the show's comedic currency, they are its emotional core. They are the moments when the show is being most honest about the specific conditions of the life it is depicting, which are the specific conditions of a very large number of lives in the actual country the show was made about. The yellow skin is the show's broadest metaphor. The household economics are its most precise social document. Number section 14. The question of memory in Springfield. Springfield forgets. This is one of the show's most commented upon structural features, usually discussed in the context of the episodic reset that returns every installment to the status quo by the time the credits roll. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt. It has been sealed under a government dome. It has survived nuclear near misses and environmental catastrophes and the full blocking of the sun. And by the following episode, without explanation or acknowledgement, everything is back to normal. Most discussions of this feature treat it as a production necessity. The episodic format demands a reset because a non-reset would require continuous tracking of accumulated consequences across a run of 788 episodes, which is practically impossible and narratively limiting. This is true. The reset is a practical decision made by the show's creators for reasons that are entirely comprehensible within the logic of television production. But the reset is also something else. The show knows it is something else. The episode that makes this most explicit, the Principal and the Pauper installment, discussed in the transcript that informs this script, demonstrates that Springfield's forgetting is not simply a production convenience. It is a choice. A sustained, deliberate, community-wide choice to prioritize the comfortable version of reality over the accurate one, enacted through collective agreement and occasionally enforced through formal mechanisms, including a judicial decree, making it illegal to speak certain truths. What the show is depicting in the episodic reset and in the Principal and the Pauper episode where the reset mechanism is made visible is a community that has developed memory as a strategic, rather than an involuntary function. Springfield remembers what it is useful to remember. It forgets what it is dangerous to remember. And the distinction between useful and dangerous is made, consistently and without apparent democratic deliberation, in the direction that protects the status quo and the interests that benefit from the status quo. The people of Springfield do not forget because they are stupid, though some of them are cognitively impaired in specific and documentable ways. They forget because remembering is more expensive than forgetting, because the things that should be remembered, the three-eyed fish and the human skeletons in the basement of the plant, and the dome and the billionaire who glows in the dark, are things whose remembering would require acknowledging what they mean, and what they mean would require a response. And the response would cost more than the town can currently afford, or believes it can afford, which in the long run amounts to the same thing. Memory in Springfield is not a cognitive function. It is an economic one. This reading of the episodic reset transforms it from a production convenience into a social portrait. The show is not failing to track its own continuity. The show is depicting, with unusual precision, the specific mechanism by which communities with limited power and significant damage manage their ongoing relationship with both. You forget the dome because remembering the dome means acknowledging the EPA's assessment of the town as a contamination zone, which means acknowledging the contamination, which means confronting the plant, which means confronting burns, which means confronting the entire economic structure that the town depends on for its continued existence. The forgetting is survival. The forgetting is the community doing the only thing it can do, which is to continue, and continuing requires not carrying more weight than the capacity for carrying allows. The show builds this portrait with the patience of something that knows it will not be noticed immediately. The resets accumulate. The forgotten catastrophes accumulate. And the accumulation, if you allow it to, begins to tell a story about the specific kind of community that the episodic structure has been depicting all along. A community not of memory loss, but of memory management. A community that knows exactly what it is doing when it chooses to forget. A community that has understood, perhaps since before any of its current residents were born, that some things are only survivable if they are not examined. Number Section 15. Springfield's Children and the Inheritance of Damage. The children of Springfield exist in a specific relationship with the damage their town carries. They did not choose the yellow skin. They did not choose the air they breathe, or the water that produces whatever it produces in developing biological systems, or the educational infrastructure that was built to serve them inadequately. They were born into these conditions the way children are born into the conditions of their particular circumstances, without consent and without the framework to understand what they have inherited until that framework has to be built from the inside. Bart and Lisa and Maggie are the show's most sustained portrait of what childhood in these specific conditions produces. 3 children, in the same household, raised by the same parents, in the same house on the same street in the same contaminated town, who have become 3 entirely different kinds of people, with 3 entirely different responses to the shared inheritance. Bart's response is refusal. He has looked at the institutions designed to shape him, and he has declined their authority over his self-definition. The school says he is a failure, and he accepts the category while rejecting its valuation, using the failure identity as a kind of armor against the specific pain of trying, and being told the trying does not qualify. The family says he is a problem, and he accepts the problem identity while building inside it, in the spaces the label leaves uncovered, the actual person he is and the actual capabilities he has, and the loyalty he extends to the people who earn it. Lisa's response is effort. She keeps trying to make the institutions around her respond to the fullness of what she brings. The school, the family, the community, the broader cultural context of Springfield, all of them are places where Lisa keeps extending the invitation to genuine engagement and receiving, with great consistency, something less than genuine engagement in return. But the effort continues. The effort is the response that her particular combination of intelligence and temperament produces, and she cannot stop making it any more than she can stop being who she is. Maggie's response is silence. The most intelligent reading of Maggie's silence, developed in the transcript that informs this script, is that it is strategic. Maggie has observed what happens to intelligent women in her immediate vicinity. She has watched Lisa extend invitation after invitation and receive refusal after refusal. She has developed, from this observation, a theory of her own optimal strategy, which is to remain beneath the level of detection that would trigger the specific responses that Lisa's visibility triggers. If you do not announce yourself, they cannot dismiss you. If you do not reveal what you know, they cannot be threatened by it. If you maintain the performance of helpless infancy, you can move through the world with a freedom that visible intelligence does not provide. Together, the 3 children are a portrait of the range of responses available to people who inherit damaged conditions and must develop some relationship with that inheritance. Refusal, effort, strategic concealment. All of them are coherent. All of them have costs. All of them are also, in their different ways, forms of love, because the damage they are responding to is also the context in which their family exists, and the family is the thing they are also, each in their own way, protecting. The show's portrait of childhood is one of its most underappreciated achievements. It depicts children as people with genuine interior lives and genuine responses to their circumstances and genuine capabilities that the adults around them frequently fail to recognize or adequately support. It does not sentimentalize childhood or present it as a protected space. It shows childhood as the specific condition of being a full person in a world that has not yet decided to treat you as one, and it tracks what that specific condition produces in 3 different people across 36 seasons, with a consistency and a care that no other program in the medium has matched. Number. Section 16. The Long Game of Mr. Burns. Charles Montgomery Burns has been alive for longer than any reasonable accounting of human biology should permit. The show places his birth somewhere in the late 1800s, which makes him, depending on which episode you are using as your reference point, somewhere between 120 and 140 years old. He has personal memories of events that most of his employees' grandparents did not live to see. He has relationships with historical figures that most American schoolchildren study in the past tense. He attended Yale. He served in a war. He has done business with governments that no longer exist. And he is still here, still in the tower of the power plant that sits on the edge of Springfield, still managing the systems he has spent over a century constructing, still unable to remember the name of the man who has worked for him for 3 decades. The Burns immortality question, discussed extensively in the transcript that precedes this script, is about biology. about the medical treatments that keep him alive, about the weekly regimen so extreme that it causes his body to emit a visible glow, about the Three Stooges syndrome that locks his diseases in a state of perfect gridlock, each one preventing the others from advancing, about Smithers as the logistical system that keeps the entire medical apparatus running. All of that is accurate and worth understanding, but there is another dimension to Burns's longevity that the biological accounting does not fully reach. The longevity of Burns is also about the longevity of a specific kind of power, and the relationship between power and time is something the show has been depicting with unusual honesty across its entire run. Burns has lasted because Burns has always understood, with the clarity that comes from having lived long enough to see multiple cycles of everything, that the specific kind of power he holds is maintained not through strength, but through dependency. You do not maintain a monopoly on electrical power for a century by being stronger than everyone who might challenge you. You maintain it by making yourself so essential to the functioning of the community that challenging you becomes synonymous with destroying yourself. Burns did not build Springfield's dependence on the plant. He built the plant knowing the dependence would follow, knowing that once the infrastructure was in place, the dependence would be self-reinforcing and self-sustaining, and that the community would eventually forget that it had ever been otherwise. This is the long game of Charles Montgomery Burns. It is not a game played across episodes but across generations. It is the game of a man who has decided that the only acceptable time horizon is the one that outlasts everyone else in the room. His wealth did not accumulate through merit or through innovation or through the specific kind of ambitious hustle that American culture tends to celebrate. It accumulated through the sustained, patient, sometimes ruthless management of dependency across a period of time that no other character in the show's universe can match. Burns's relationship with Homer is the show's most precise expression of this strategy. Homer is not employed at the plant because he is the best available candidate for the safety inspector position. Homer is employed there because Homer, with his specific combination of cognitive limitation and emotional damage and terror of abandonment, is the optimal person to have in that specific role. Homer will not notice the violations. Homer will not report them if he does notice. Homer will not organize his fellow workers. Homer will not quit because quitting would mean risking the stability that the job provides, and Homer's entire psychology is organized around the preservation of the stability of his family above all other considerations. Burns did not find Homer already broken. Burns found Homer's circumstances and built the conditions that would ensure Homer's brokenness could be relied upon. The deal with Abe, the guarantee of continued employment, the structure that ensures Homer cannot be fired and therefore has no leverage and no incentive to perform better or demand more. All of it is architecture. All of it is the long game being played at the level of individual lives. The genius of Burns as a character is that the show makes him genuinely menacing while also making him genuinely ridiculous. He cannot open a door unaided. He is physically frail to the point of parody. His references are so chronologically displaced that they read as comedy. He cannot remember the name of his longest-serving employee, and yet the comedy of his physical and social limitations does not diminish the menace of what he has done and continues to do. The comedy makes the menace survivable to watch. The menace makes the comedy something more than just a joke about an old man who is out of touch. Burns is what remains of a century of unchecked power. He is the residue of every deal made and every truth suppressed, and every dependency cultivated, and every person diminished in service of the accumulation and preservation of something that was never intended to be shared. He is the reason the fish have 3 eyes. He is the reason the town is yellow. He is the reason Homer is who Homer is, and Marge is carrying what Marge carries, and Bart refuses the way Bart refuses, and Lisa plays to an audience of 1 in the register of things that cannot be received. And he sits in his tower every morning and he cannot remember Homer's name, and the show plays it as a joke, and we laugh, and the long game continues. Number. Section 17. What the opening credits were always saying. The couch gag has been a feature of the show's opening credits for 36 years. Each episode, after the title card, and the chalkboard punishment, and the saxophone line, and the skateboard chase, and the car pulling into the garage, the family runs to the couch and finds something different waiting for them. Sometimes the couch is occupied. Sometimes the couch is transformed into something impossible. Sometimes the family itself is transformed on the way to the couch. Sometimes the entire process of getting to the couch takes longer than the episode that follows it. The couch gag is the show's most persistent formal joke. It is also, if you allow it to be, the show's most persistent formal statement. The family runs to the couch every episode, and every episode something is different about what they find when they get there, and every episode they sit down together anyway, whatever configuration the gag has left them in, and the episode begins. The running is always the same, the arrival is always different, the sitting together happens regardless. This is a portrait of the family's relationship with the domestic space they share, rendered in 30 seconds of animation at the top of every episode for 36 years. The home is never simply itself. The home is always both the place they are running toward and the place where something unexpected waits. The home is comfort and surprise, and the specific combination of familiarity and strangeness that constitutes living with other people over long periods of time. And the family sits down in it regardless, because the sitting together is more important than the configuration. The opening credits before the couch gag are doing something different and something more sustained. The sequence moves through Springfield. It shows you the town before it shows you the family. The power plant with its cooling towers, the streets and the buildings, and the specific texture of a place that has been inhabited for a long time and shows the evidence of that habitation. The school, the store, the bar, the church. The town in its full geographic spread, establishing that the family exists inside something larger than the family, that the world of the show is bigger than the house on Evergreen Terrace, and that the house is situated within a community with its own character and its own history and its own relationship with the forces that have shaped it. By the time the characters converge on the couch, they have traveled through Springfield to get there. Homer past the plant, Marge past the supermarket, Bart past the school, Lisa playing her saxophone in a music class whose teacher sends her out for being too good, a detail that gets repeated in the same credit sequence for 36 years, and that constitutes, if you attend to it, a 30-second summary of the entire Lisa story. She is too much. She is sent out. She continues playing anyway, in the hallway, where the sound continues regardless of whether anyone is listening. The opening credits sequence is a 2-minute documentary about everything the show is doing. It shows you the town and the family and the specific relationship between them, the way the town shapes the family and the way the family moves through the town, before the episode begins and the comedy takes over and the surface becomes the subject. If you have watched this sequence enough times, and 36 seasons is enough time to have watched it enough times, it begins to accumulate. The cooling towers become familiar, and then the familiarity becomes the point, because the cooling towers being familiar is exactly the condition the show has been depicting from the beginning. The yellow skin becomes visible in the opening credits before it becomes visible in the episode, and then you stop seeing it, and then, if you are paying attention, you start seeing it again. The opening credits have been telling you what the show is about from the beginning. 2 minutes, every episode, 36 years. The cooling towers and the saxophone in the hallway, and the family running to the couch, and whatever waits for them when they get there, and the sitting down together regardless. Section 18. The show the writers were actually making. The Simpsons writing room, particularly in the peak seasons, was one of the most unusual creative environments in the history of American television. The writers who assembled in that room brought educational and professional backgrounds that were not typical for a comedy writing staff in the late 1980s and early 90s. Multiple writers held advanced degrees from institutions including Harvard, Yale, and other universities with serious academic reputations. Several had backgrounds in mathematics and the sciences. Several had done graduate work in literature or philosophy or history. Several had worked in other forms of writing before television found them. This combination is not incidental to what the show was. The specific texture of the show's humor, the way it moved between registers, the way it could sustain a high-level satirical argument in the same episode where it was executing a perfect physical comedy bit, the way it could make a joke that required familiarity with quantum physics and a joke that required only knowledge of what a donut looks like and land both within 30 seconds, this texture came directly from the unusual range of the people in the room. But the educational background also shaped what the show was saying, beyond the jokes. Writers who have been trained to think carefully about social systems and economic structures and historical patterns bring those frameworks to the material they create, whether or not they intend to. The show's portrait of Springfield's class structure, the show's understanding of how institutional power perpetuates itself, the show's specific knowledge of what poverty and working-class economic anxiety actually feel like in practice, All of this is the product of people who had thought carefully about these things, in formal and informal contexts, before they sat down to write a cartoon about a yellow family. The show was, in this sense, always the show the writers were making rather than only the show the network ordered. The network ordered a comedy. The writers made a comedy that was also a sustained social portrait, a meditation on family and damage and love and the specific quality of American life in the late 20th century. They made it funny enough that the network could not object to what it was saying, because the jokes were too good to resist, and the jokes contained the argument, and the argument came along with the jokes without requiring explicit acknowledgement. This is one of the reasons the show's cultural impact has been so durable and so complex. Most television comedies are only what they appear to be. The Simpsons was always at least two things simultaneously, and the second thing, the thing underneath the comedy, is the thing that has made the show a continuing object of serious attention across 3 decades of critical and cultural analysis. The writers were making a documentary dressed as a cartoon. They were making a social portrait dressed as a sitcom. They were making an argument about American life dressed as a family comedy, and they dressed it well enough that most of the audience received the comedy without necessarily receiving the argument, which was fine, because the argument was always there for the receiving. It was always available. It has been available for 36 seasons. It is available still. Number. Section 19. The Sunday evening ritual and what it meant. For a very large number of people, The Simpsons occupies a specific place in the geography of childhood memory. Not the place of a television show exactly, more the place of a Sunday evening itself. The specific quality of a Sunday evening in late childhood and early adolescence, when the week's work was done and the new week had not yet begun, and the family was in the house together in the specific configuration that television produces, gathered around the set, the room lit by the screen, the sound of the show filling the space. The Simpsons was a Sunday evening show for most of its run. 8 o'clock on Fox, which was itself a slightly marginal place in the American television landscape when the show began, a fourth network competing with the 3 established networks that had defined American television for decades. The marginality of the network and the Sunday evening slot combined to create a specific context for the show's reception. It was the show you watched after dinner, before the week resumed. It was the show that marked the end of the weekend and the beginning of the return. This timing was not incidental. The show's emotional content, its portrait of a family and a town, its sustained meditation on what ordinary American life actually contained underneath the surfaces it presented, landed differently at 8 o'clock on a Sunday evening than it would have at any other time. Sunday evening is when children are most aware of the family they are part of, most attentive to the texture of the domestic space they inhabit, most available to the specific kind of emotional resonance that the show was providing. The homework is done or deferred. The dinner plates have been cleared. The house has the quality that houses get on Sunday evenings, of something temporary about to become something permanent, of the weekend structure about to give way to the week structure, of everything being exactly as it is right now before the movement begins again. Into that specific quality of attention, the show delivered Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie every Sunday for 36 years. It delivered the yellow skin and the floating timeline and the cracked cooling towers and the episodic reset and all of the things this script has been attending to across its many sections. It delivered them to children who would grow up to be the adults watching now, who would carry the show in their bodies as something more than entertainment, as a texture, a soundtrack, a specific quality of Sunday evening attention that they associated with safety and family, and the particular kind of home that only exists when you are young enough to be inside it without knowing that it will eventually end. The show understood this about its audience, because the show was always paying attention to what family means and what home means and what the specific quality of being in a particular place at a particular time with particular people means, and how that quality accumulates across years of repetition into something that cannot be fully articulated but that is felt immediately and precisely, the moment the theme music began. That is what made the show so difficult to leave, even as the quality shifted in the later seasons. The music still begins the same way. The credits still move through Springfield in the same sequence. Homer still drives past the plant, and Bart still rides his skateboard, and Lisa still plays in the hallway, and Marge still navigates the supermarket, and they still all converge on the couch, in whatever configuration the couch gag provides, and sit down together. And for a few seconds before the episode begins, the Sunday evening quality is still there. The specific texture of that childhood attention, that particular quality of being gathered together in the light of the screen while something outside the window is getting dark. The show still provides it. The ritual still holds. And that, more than any quality assessment or critical analysis or fan theory about comas and radiation and who shot Mr. Burns, is why people are still watching. Because the Sunday evening ends. The childhood ends. The specific configuration of people in the house ends. But the show keeps beginning, every episode, with the same music and the same credits and the same family running to the same couch. And for a few seconds, before the jokes start and the episode takes over, you are back in the Sunday evening, and the family is still there. And nothing has ended yet. Section 20. The final couch. Every theory about Springfield leads back to the couch. The radiation theory leads there because the couch is where the family gathers in the specific domestic formation that the radiation's effects on their cognition have made possible. The gathering of people who cannot fully examine their own conditions, sitting together in the accumulated warmth of what those conditions have produced. The coma theory leads there because the couch is the center of Homer's dream, the fixed point around which the dream organizes itself, the place where the family is always together and always safe in the specific safety of a dream that refuses to advance time. The immortality theory leads there because Burns, for all his centuries of accumulated power and all his medical infrastructure and all his weekly treatments and all his strategic deployment of dependency, will never sit on that couch, will never be inside the specific configuration of warmth and dysfunction and love that the couch holds, because the couch requires a kind of family that cannot be purchased or managed or extended through medical intervention. The couch is the show's thesis, rendered in furniture. Every episode begins with the family on the couch and ends with the family in the same basic configuration. Whatever the episode has done in between, the family persists, the configuration holds. The couch is still there and the family is still on it, and the story that the show has been telling for 36 years about this specific family in this specific town carrying this specific inherited damage continues. The ending of that story, when it comes, will be the most significant moment in the show's history. Not because the final episode will necessarily be better than the peak seasons. It probably will not be. But because the ending will be the moment when the floating timeline stops floating and the accumulated weight of 36 years of not ending comes to rest somewhere. When Bart turns 11. When Lisa is finally allowed to be 9. When Maggie speaks for the second time, and the first word becomes the beginning of something the show never had to accommodate before, because the show never had to accommodate endings. The ending will also be the moment when it becomes possible to see the whole thing clearly for the first time. Because you cannot see the shape of something while you are still inside it. The couch gag has been running for 36 years, and we have been watching it from inside the gag, inside the Springfield, that the show built around us over decades of Sunday evenings and cultural accumulation. When it ends, when the show stops and we step outside it, we will be able to turn around and look at the whole shape of what was made. And what we will see, looking back at 36 seasons of a show that was always two things simultaneously, will be the show it was always trying to be, rather than the show it appeared to be from the inside. The comedy will still be there, because the comedy is real and it is excellent and it will always be excellent. But the other thing will be more visible than it ever was during the run, because it will have the completed shape of something finished rather than the ambiguous shape of something ongoing. The yellow skin and the floating timeline, and the cracked cooling towers, and the episodic resets, and the grief architecture of Homer, and the invisible collapse of Marge and Bart's refusal, and Lisa's loneliness and Maggie's silence will all be visible at once in their full shape. And the shape will be something that looks a great deal less like a comedy than it looked from inside the Sunday evenings where we first encountered it. Something that looks, from outside and after the fact, like one of the most sustained and honest portraits of a specific kind of human life that American television has ever attempted. Not despite the comedy, because of it. The comedy is why it lasted. The lasting is why the portrait is complete. And the completeness, when we are finally able to see it, will be why the show was never quite what we thought it was. It was never a comedy. It was 36 years of truth in the specific costume that truth wears when it needs to be let inside. It was the family on the couch yellow and impossible and damaged and loving, in a town that chose not to ask and a country that recognized itself in the choosing, for as long as either could sustain the recognition. The couch is still there, the family is still on it, the show is still beginning every episode, with the same music and the same credits, and the same running, and the same convergence. And somewhere in the running, in the 30 seconds between the title card and the couch, the show is still saying what it has always been saying. In the yellow, in the cooling towers, in the saxophone playing in the hallway of a school that sent her out for being too much. Still playing, still there, still available to anyone willing to stop moving through the comedy long enough to hear what is underneath it. That is the whole thing. That is what we have been sitting with, in all these hours in Springfield. The show is still there when you go back to it. The family is still on the couch. The cooling towers are still cracked, and the yellow skin catches the light in every frame, in the color of a warning that was always meant to be read by the people who were always meant to read it. You were always meant to be one of those people. That is why the show kept beginning, and that, in the end, is why it will always be worth returning to. Number Section 21. The Architecture of the Apology. There is something the show does repeatedly that almost no other television comedy has ever done, and it does it quietly enough that most viewers receive it without quite recognizing what they have received. It apologizes. Not directly, not through dialogue or explicit acknowledgement, but structurally. Through the way it positions certain scenes, relative to the comedy that precedes them. The pattern works like this. An episode runs its comedy through its first act and most of its second. The jokes land. The situations escalate in the specific way that Simpsons situations escalate, through a combination of character consistency and escalating absurdity that the show manages with a precision most comedy cannot match. And then, in the final minutes or in a specific scene positioned near the end, the comedy steps back, not all the way, not so completely that the episode abandons its register, but enough. Enough that something else can occupy the frame for a minute or two before the credits. Homer apologizing to his daughter, Marge sitting with her husband in the quiet that comes after a fight has resolved, Bart doing something genuinely kind for someone who did not expect it and who the show does not linger on long enough to make the kindness into a joke. These are the apologies. The show apologizing for having made you laugh at these people by reminding you that they are people, by showing you the thing underneath the character that the character was covering for the length of the episode. With comedy, the apology is not required. Most comedy programs do not feel the need to make it. They build their characters into types, and they serve the types consistently, and the types are funny, and the audience receives the comedy and goes to bed, and the next week the types are assembled again for another round. The Simpsons could have do. Section 25. The Father Who Could Not See Himself. There is a version of Homer Simpson that the show almost never allows you to see directly. It appears in fragments, in flashes, in the specific moments when the comedy steps back far enough that the person underneath becomes visible for a few seconds before the reset returns. It is the version of Homer that exists when the crayon is not in his brain, and the radiation has not done what the radiation does, and the accumulated damage of his specific childhood, and his specific working life, and his specific relationship with a town that has been quietly poisoning him have not reduced him to the character the comedy needs him to be. In the episode where the crayon is removed, this version surfaces. Homer becomes articulate. He becomes capable of sustained complex thought. He notices things he has never noticed. He sees the quality of Lisa's intelligence clearly for the first time, and is able to respond to it in kind, able to match her register, able to give her the conversation partner she has never had inside her own family. He sees his job for what it is. He sees his town for what it is. He sees, with a clarity that no other version of Homer has ever been permitted, the full shape of the life he has been living. And it is unbearable. Not because the life is bad in absolute terms. The life has love in it. The family is real. The house is a real house, and the couch is a real couch, and Marge is genuinely there, and the children are genuinely his, and the neighborhood is genuinely the neighborhood he has lived in for his entire adult life. All of that is real. What is unbearable is seeing it clearly, knowing what it is and what it costs and what it forecloses, knowing that the job is not just a job but a structural position in a system designed to hold him exactly where he is, knowing that the town he lives in is a contamination zone that his own employer has arranged, knowing that his father made a deal that guaranteed his continued employment in exchange for his continued silence about something he witnessed, and that this deal, made without Homer's knowledge or consent, is a significant part of why Homer is where Homer is. The clarity is unbearable because the clarity does not come with the capacity to do anything about what it reveals. Homer is still Homer. He still lives in Springfield. He still works at the plant. The crayon's removal has not changed his circumstances. It has only changed his ability to see his circumstances. And seeing clearly without the ability to change what you see is a specific kind of suffering that the show depicts with unusual honesty in this episode. So he puts the crayon back. He chooses the fog. He chooses the reduced capacity and the softened edges and the comedy-ready version of his own consciousness over the unbearable sharpness of seeing himself and his life with full clarity. He chooses, in other words, what most people in his circumstances would choose, which is survivability over accuracy, the comfortable version of reality over the accurate one. This is the most honest thing the show has ever done. Not the radiation theory or the coma theory or any of the elaborate architectures of fan interpretation that have been built around the show's 36 years of content. The most honest thing is Homer putting the crayon back. Because that choice, the choice to return to the fog because the clarity is not survivable, is a choice that enormous numbers of people in real circumstances, with real limitations, have made and continue to make. Not because they are weak or stupid or unable to handle the truth, because the truth, seen clearly and fully, without the accompanying capacity to change the circumstances the truth reveals, is not something human beings were designed to sustain indefinitely. Homer puts the crayon back and the show lets him, does not judge him, does not position the choice as a failure or a tragedy or even a comedy beat, just lets him choose, and lets the choice stand, and lets the fog return, and moves on. Because the show knows that this is what happens, this is what people do, and the knowing of it, the willingness to depict it without judgment and without resolution, is one of the deepest things the show has ever done. The father who could not see himself chose not to see himself, and the love he has for his family, which is real and which is not diminished by the fog, continues in the softened form that the fog permits, which is not the same as the love he might have extended from full clarity. But it is the love that was available, and the love that was available is what his family received, and what his family received is what they became. The Homer underneath the comedy is a man who looked at himself clearly once and found the clarity unsustainable and chose to return to the version of himself that could survive Springfield. And Springfield took him back without comment, because Springfield has always preferred the version of people that can survive it over the version that can see it clearly. The fog serves everyone. The fog is the deal. Number. Section 26. What Lisa knew that nobody else did. Lisa Simpson has been 8 years old for 36 years, and she has spent every one of those years knowing something that the people around her either cannot see or will not acknowledge. The knowing is the substance of her character. It is what makes her the most quietly devastating figure in the show's cast, and the one whose presence most consistently surfaces the show's deeper argument. What Lisa knows is not any single piece of information. It is not a secret, not a conspiracy, not the kind of knowledge that comes from having discovered something hidden. What Lisa knows is the texture of her own situation. She knows she is in a place that cannot adequately receive what she has to offer. She knows that the gap between what she is and what Springfield can accommodate is not going to close. She knows, with the specific clarity of a child who has not yet learned to protect herself from what she sees by not looking at it, that the world she has been born into is not organized in her favor, and that reorganizing it is beyond the capacity of any effort she is capable of making on her own. She knows all of this and she keeps trying anyway. This is the part of Lisa's story that the show has been telling across 36 seasons with a consistency that constitutes one of its most sustained achievements. She knows the effort will not be enough, and she keeps making the effort, not out of naivety, because Lisa is not naive, not out of optimism, because Lisa's relationship with optimism is complicated at best. She keeps making the effort because the effort is what she has, and the alternative to the effort is a capitulation that she is not constitutionally capable of making. The saxophone is the show's simplest and most complete symbol for this. Lisa plays the saxophone. In the opening credits, her music teacher sends her out of the class for being too good, too advanced, too much for the context she is in. And she stands in the hallway and plays anyway. Alone in the hallway of a school that sent her out, playing to the empty corridor, making the music regardless of whether anyone is listening. This image runs in the opening credits of every episode of the show. It has run there for 36 years. And most viewers have watched it so many times that they no longer see it, the way you stop seeing the furniture in a room you have inhabited long enough. But it is there, in every episode. The kid in the hallway playing to no one, because the music is worth making even when there is no one to receive it. Because some things are worth doing regardless of the reception they find. Because the alternative, putting the saxophone down and going home, is not an alternative that Lisa's particular constitution permits. This is what Lisa knew. Not as articulated knowledge, but as lived knowledge. The kind that is in the body before it is in the mind. She knew that she would spend her life making music in hallways. And she kept making it. And the show kept showing you the image, in every episode, in 30 seconds of opening credits animation, for 36 years. That is the whole Lisa story. That is everything. The hallway and the saxophone and the music that continues regardless of whether anyone is listening. And the showing of it, consistently and without resolution, across the entire run of the show, is the show saying that this is real, that this is what happens. That there are people who play in hallways their whole lives, and the playing is the thing, and the reception is beside the point, and the music is worth making regardless. It is saying this through a yellow cartoon child with a red dress and a saxophone, in 30 seconds of credits animation, every episode for 36 years. And if you watch it enough times, it begins to feel less like a credit sequence and more like a thesis. Less like an introduction and more like the entire argument, compressed into its simplest possible form. The kid in the hallway, the music that continues, the door closed behind her and the corridor empty in front of her and the notes going out into the air regardless. That is the show. That is what the show was always doing. In all its forms and across all its seasons and through all the comedy and all the apology and all the elaborate fan theories and all the accumulated Sunday evenings, making music in a hallway, sending it out into the air, whether anyone was listening or not. Number, Section 27. Springfield's Real Monster. The show has given Springfield many monsters over its run. The Treehouse of Horror episodes have provided an annual supply of them, vampires and zombies and cursed objects and malevolent entities of various descriptions. The regular canon episodes have their own version of monster, which is Burns, who is the show's most sustained portrait of the specific kind of destructive power that does not require supernatural explanation. But Springfield's real monster is neither of these. Springfield's real monster is the one that the show has never named directly, because naming it directly would require a different kind of program than the one the show has always been. The real monster is the system. The specific configuration of economic dependency and institutional power and collective denial and accumulated damage that constitutes the actual structure of Springfield's existence. The system is not Burns, though Burns is its most visible embodiment and its most direct beneficiary. Burns could die, as the show has repeatedly demonstrated he might, and the system would continue. The plant would continue. The economic dependency would continue. The specific relationship between the people of Springfield and the institution that employs and poisons them would continue, because the system exists independent of any individual actor within it. Burns built it, and Burns maintains it, and Burns would be genuinely devastated by its collapse. But the system is larger than Burns in the specific way that all systems are larger than the individuals who inhabit even their most powerful positions. The system is not Homer either, though Homer's position within it is one of the show's most precise depictions of how systems perpetuate themselves through the specific vulnerabilities of specific people. Homer's compliance is not personal weakness. It is the rational response of a person who has been given very limited options and has chosen the option that best preserves what matters most to him, which is the stability of his family. A different Homer, one with different options, might make different choices. The system has ensured that Homer's options are what they are, which is to say limited enough that compliance is the most rational available response. The system is not Marge, though Marge's sustained, quiet, largely uncelebrated work of keeping the family functional within the system's constraints is one of the most honest portraits of a specific kind of labor that the show has produced. Marge holds the family together. She holds it together with a patience and a competence that the show largely declines to celebrate, because the system does not celebrate the work that holds it together. The system benefits from the work and declines to acknowledge the benefit, because acknowledging the benefit would mean acknowledging the cost, and acknowledging the cost would mean acknowledging that someone is paying it, and acknowledging that someone is paying it would mean acknowledging that someone has been tasked with paying it. And acknowledging that someone has been tasked with paying it would mean asking who did the tasking and why. The system prefers not to follow that chain of questions to its end. The real monster of Springfield is the arrangement, the specific way that everything fits together to produce exactly this outcome, exactly this configuration of people in exactly these positions, carrying exactly this damage, and receiving exactly this amount of what they are owed. The arrangement is what keeps Homer at the plant, and Marge at the kitchen table, and Lisa in the hallway, and Bart in the space of productive rebellion, and Maggie watching everything from behind the pacifier, and Burns in the tower above it, all managing the treatments that keep him alive for exactly one more week. The arrangement is not dramatic. It does not have a face or a voice or a specific moment of origin that can be identified and addressed. It is the accumulated result of thousands of decisions made by many actors over a long period of time, each decision locally rational, and each decision contributing to a global outcome that no individual actor specifically intended. This is what makes it a monster. Not its malevolence, which is real but diffuse, but its indifference. The system does not hate Homer. It does not hate the people of Springfield. It simply operates in the way it operates, and the way it operates has consequences for the people inside it, and those consequences have been visible in every frame of the show since the first episode. The show's greatest achievement is that it has made this visible without ever having to name it. It put the cracked cooling towers in the background, and the yellow skin in the foreground, and the floating timeline in the structure, and the episodic reset in the format, and the economics in the household, and Burns in the tower, and Homer at the desk, and Marge at the table, and Lisa in the hallway. And it arranged all of these elements with sufficient precision that the arrangement itself becomes legible. The monster becomes visible in the arrangement rather than in any individual element of it. That is documentary work. That is the work of a show that knows what it is depicting and has the skill to depict it in a way that makes the depiction available without requiring the audience to receive it in any particular way. The comedy is available. The apology is available. The social portrait is available. The monster is available. And every viewer receives whatever they are ready to receive, and what they are ready to receive tells them something about where they are in their own relationship to the arrangements that constitute their own lives. Springfield is real. The arrangement is real, the monster is real, and the show has been depicting it, in yellow, every Sunday for 36 years. Number. Section 28. Marge at the window. There is a specific image that the show returns to across its run. Not the couch gag, which is the show's most famous recurring visual. Not the power plant, which is the show's most narratively central recurring image. The image is Marge at the window. She appears there in many different episodes across many different seasons. At the kitchen window looking out at the yard, at the living room window looking out at the street, at various windows in various configurations of the domestic space. She is usually alone. She is usually not doing anything that can be identified as a specific task. She is between tasks, between moments, in the specific quality of attention that belongs to the space between one thing that needs doing and the next. She stands there and looks out the window, and the show holds the image for a moment longer than comedy requires. Longer than the scene needs. Just long enough to let the image exist as an image rather than as a beat in a sequence. Long enough to let Marge be present in the frame as a person rather than as a plot function. The show almost never tells you what Marge is thinking in these moments. It does not need to. The image is sufficient. The woman at the window, looking out at the world she inhabits without the show needing to narrate her inner state, carrying whatever she carries in the specific privacy of being briefly unobserved inside her own home. The children are elsewhere. Homer is elsewhere. The house is quiet in the particular way that a house full of people gets quiet when all those people are somewhere other than where you are. Marge at the window is the show's most sustained and most compressed portrait of its own emotional subject matter. It is the image that contains in the fewest possible elements the fullest possible summary of what the show has been about. A woman of significant capability in a life that provides limited space for that capability to fully express itself, present and patient, and carrying more than the comedy tends to acknowledge, looking out at the world she has chosen and accepted, and continues to choose and accept, every day, in the specific way that the people who hold families together tend to do. The image is not tragic. It would be dishonest to call it tragic. Marge has chosen this life and continues to choose it. The show has been careful, across its run, to depict this choice as a genuine choice rather than as a constraint or a resignation. Marge loves her family. The love is real. The choice is real. The life she has is not the life she would have designed from scratch, perhaps, but it is the life she has made, and she has made it with more skill and more care and more genuine competence than the comedy tends to honor. The window image honors it. Silently, briefly, without narration or comment, the show holds the image of the woman who holds everything together. In the moment when holding everything together is not required, and she can simply be present at a window, looking out, thinking whatever she is thinking in the privacy of not being needed for a moment. This is the show at its best. This is the show doing what no other comedy program of its era did with anything close to this frequency or this precision. Seeing the person inside the type, giving the type a moment of private existence that the type does not usually receive, holding the window image long enough to honor what it contains. Marge at the window is why the show was never a comedy. It was always something that comedies do not tend to be, which is attentive. Attentive to the specific, quiet, largely unacknowledged interior lives of the people it was depicting. Attentive in the specific way that you can only be attentive to people you are genuinely interested in, rather than merely using. The show was genuinely interested in Marge, in Homer, in Bart and Lisa and Maggie and the secondary characters whose weight the comedy was built on, and whose specific humanity the show kept returning to through the apology. The attentiveness is the thing. The attentiveness is what made it more than entertainment. The attentiveness is what made it a document of a specific time and a specific place and a specific configuration of people living inside the specific conditions of that time and place. And the attentiveness, accumulated across 36 seasons of weekly episodes, constitutes a portrait of American domestic life that no other work in any medium has matched for duration or for reach or for the specific combination of comedy and honesty that makes the portrait survivable to look at. Marge is still at the window. The show is still holding the image. And whatever she is thinking, standing there in the specific quiet of between moments in the house that she holds together by the sheer, sustained force of her presence, is something the show has always trusted you to imagine without narrating it. That trust is also part of the attentiveness. The show trusts you with the window. It trusts you to fill the silence with the appropriate recognition. It trusts you to know what Marge is carrying, because you have been watching long enough to know, because the show has been honest enough across 36 seasons, that you have accumulated the knowledge without needing it to be explained. You know what she is thinking at the window. You have always known. The show showed you everything you needed to know. Section 29. What the show said about America, that America said back. The Simpsons and America have been in a specific kind of conversation for 36 years. The show depicts America. America watches the depiction. America incorporates the depiction into its self-understanding. The self-understanding shapes future behavior. The future behavior becomes the reality that the next season of the show depicts. The loop continues. This is not unique to The Simpsons. All popular culture participates in this loop with the society that produces and consumes it. But The Simpsons has been in the loop for longer than any other American television program, and the longevity of the participation has produced something that shorter-running programs cannot produce, which is an accumulated record of the conversation over time. A record of what America showed the show and what the show showed America back, and how each changed in response to the other. The show said that the American family was yellow and damaged, and loving and funny, and incapable of examining its own conditions, and in love with the comfortable fiction over the accurate reality, and sustained by a combination of genuine affection and structural dependency and enormous resilience. In the face of circumstances that should be less bearable than they are, America looked at the depiction and said, yes. Not out loud, not explicitly, but through the act of continued watching, through the act of making the show the most watched program on its network for years, and the most referenced comedy in the culture for decades, and the object of more sustained critical and fan analysis than any other animated program in the history of the medium. America said yes to the portrait. America recognized itself in the yellow skin, and the cracked cooling towers, and the episodic reset and all of it. And then America said something back. America said, "But we are also the people who cannot stop watching. We are also the people who return to the family on the couch every Sunday. We are also the people who have memorized the lines from episodes that aired before some of us were born and quote them in the specific register of people who share a language that not everyone speaks. We are also the community of people who were formed, in part, by sitting in the specific quality of Sunday evening attention with this specific program, and who carry that formation in our bodies as something that does not reduce to entertainment." The show received this response and incorporated it. The later seasons, whatever their quality fluctuations, are aware of the accumulated weight of the audience's relationship with the show in a way that the early seasons could not be. Because the early seasons had not yet accumulated the weight, the later seasons are made by and for people who have been watching for decades, and the making is different when the making is for people who know everything you have already done. The show became, in its later seasons, a conversation with its own history, and that conversation is different from the conversation it was having with American society in the early seasons, though both conversations are real and both are worth attending to. What the show said about America was specific and honest and sometimes uncomfortable. What America said back was, "We see ourselves and we are returning anyway, because the seeing is part of what we need, because the seeing is what the show provides that most of the rest of the available entertainment does not." The conversation is still happening. It has been happening for 36 years, and the accumulated transcript of it, if you could read it, would constitute something close to a record of American self-understanding in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. What the country thought about itself, what it was willing to see, what it preferred not to see, what it found funny and what it found true, and where those two categories overlapped, which is where the show has always lived. That is the conversation. That is what the show and America have been having, through the medium of a yellow family on a couch in a town that cannot be located on any map for 36 years. The conversation continues. Springfield is still on the air. America is still watching. And whatever the next episode says, and whatever America says back, the accumulation of what has already been said is sitting there in the archive, available to anyone who wants to read it. It is the longest conversation American television has ever had with itself, and it is not finished yet. Number. Section 30. The show that will not end, and why. The Simpsons will end. Every show ends. Every show that has ever aired ended or will end. And The Simpsons will not be an exception to this rule despite having operated for a period of time that makes the rule feel less certain than it once did. When it ends, it will be an event of unusual cultural weight. Not just because the show is long-running, though the duration is extraordinary. Not just because of the audience it has accumulated, though the audience is vast. Because the ending will be the first time the floating timeline lands. The first time the characters are allowed to exist in a completed, rather than a continuing state. The first time the story has a shape that can be seen from outside rather than only from within. The ending will be, in this specific sense, the beginning of the show's real relationship with its own meaning. Because meaning, the full accounting of what a thing is and what it did and what it left behind, requires completion. A story that is still being told cannot be fully understood. The telling is part of the understanding, and while the telling continues, the understanding is always provisional. When the show ends, the full 36 seasons plus whatever additional seasons follow before the ending will become a single object, a completed work, something that can be stood back from and seen in its entirety for the first time. And the seeing will reveal things that the episode-by-episode experience cannot reveal, because the episode-by-episode experience is an experience of accumulation in progress, and the completed object is an experience of shape. The shape will be remarkable. The shape of 36 years of a program that was always two things simultaneously: a comedy and a document, a family sitcom and a social portrait, a joke and an apology, will be the shape of something that no other program in the history of American television has produced. Not because the show is the greatest program ever made, though it contains some of the greatest television ever made. Because it is the longest. Because it ran long enough to accumulate into something that shorter programs cannot accumulate into, which is a complete portrait of a particular era of American life from the inside. The show will not end because it is finished. It will end because everything ends. And the ending will be arbitrary in the specific way that the endings of long-running programs tend to be, a decision made for reasons that are partially creative and partially commercial, and partially the result of the specific circumstances of the people involved at the moment the decision is made. The ending will not feel proportionate to the accumulation that precedes it, because nothing could feel proportionate to 36 years. But the ending will complete the object, and the completed object will sit there, in the archive and in the culture and in the memory of everyone who watched any part of it in any quality of attention, and it will be available for anyone who wants to go back and look at the whole shape of it, for anyone who wants to understand what American television did with a yellow family and a cracked cooling tower and a floating timeline for 36 years, for anyone who wants to know what the show was really saying underneath the comedy in all those Sunday evenings. It is all there. It has always been there. And when the ending comes, whenever the ending comes, it will still be there. Yellow and impossible and honest and funny and sad and more real than most real things. The show that would not end will end. And then the real watching can begin. Number. Section 31. The specific weight of 36 years. There is a kind of cultural weight that only accumulates across time, and it accumulates differently from the kind of weight that arrives all at once. A film can carry enormous weight from its first screening. A novel can change the way people think before anyone has finished reading it. The weight of a single arrival, a single completed object delivered to an audience at a specific moment, is a real and significant kind of weight. The Simpsons has a different kind of weight. The weight that comes from being present continuously for 36 years. From being part of the weekly rhythm of enough people's lives that the rhythm itself became structural. From being the show that was always on, always available, always ready to receive whatever quality of attention you brought to it on any given Sunday evening, regardless of what else was happening in your life or in the culture. This weight is not the weight of a masterpiece. A masterpiece is a single object, arrived at once, standing alone. The Simpsons is not a masterpiece in this sense. It is something else. It is an institution in the specific sense that real institutions carry, meaning a structure that exists independent of any individual component, and that persists through changes in personnel and quality and external circumstance, because the structure itself has become necessary to the community that surrounds it. The show became necessary, not in the way that food or shelter or medical care are necessary, but in the softer and equally real sense that certain cultural objects become necessary to the communities that are formed around them. The people who were formed by Sunday evenings with The Simpsons carry that formation whether they continue watching or not. The formation happened. It is in the body. It shaped the specific texture of what family means, and what home means, and what comedy means, and what the particular combination of love and dysfunction looks like when it is rendered honestly and with skill. The weight of 36 years is the weight of all of that formation, accumulated across every person who has ever sat down on a Sunday evening and received whatever the show was offering that particular week. Multiplied by the number of people who have done this across 36 years, which is a very large number. Multiplied by the number of times the same person returned, which in many cases is also a very large number. The accumulated formation of that watching is something that no individual episode can carry alone, but that the entire run carries together. It is the weight of a conversation that has been going on for longer than most of its current participants have been alive. The weight of a shared language spoken by people who may share very little else. The weight of the specific quality of Sunday evening attention, repeated across decades, until the repetition becomes its own form of meaning. When people quote The Simpsons to each other, they are not just quoting a line. They are activating a shared formation. They are signaling membership in the community of people who were shaped by the same, sustained exposure to the same program over overlapping or adjacent periods of time. The quote is a recognition signal. It is the community recognizing itself through the shared vocabulary the show provided. This is what institutions do. This is what The Simpsons has done across 36 years of continuous operation. It has produced a community by producing a shared experience, and the shared experience has accumulated into a shared formation, and the shared formation has become a community with its own language and its own rituals and its own specific quality of recognition. When two members encounter each other in the wild, the weight of that community, of that formation, of those 36 years of shared Sunday evening attention, is the heaviest thing the show carries. Heavier than any individual episode. Heavier than any fan theory or critical analysis or cultural assessment. The weight of having been there, continuously for 36 years, doing the thing it was doing for the people who needed it to do that thing? That is the real legacy. Not the predictions or the records or the cultural impact measured in referenced episodes and quoted lines. The weight of presence across time. The weight of having been there. Number, Section 32. The love inside the damage. After everything this script has explored, after all the theories and the social portraits and the honest accountings of what the radiation is doing, and what the institutional power is extracting, and what the damage costs, and who is paying it, there is something that needs to be said directly and without irony and without the protective coating of theoretical framing. The Simpsons is a love story. Not exclusively, not simply, not in the way that would make the theories redundant or the social portrait irrelevant, but fundamentally, at the level of what the show is made of and why it was made, and why it has continued to be made, and why people return to it across decades of changed personal circumstances, and changed cultural context, and changed critical assessment of its quality. The show loves the Simpson family. It loves Homer with all the fog and the damage and the crayon in his brain and the radiation and the grief of the mother who left. It loves him in the specific way that a portrait loves its subject, which is to say by seeing him fully and without selective omission, taking the difficult parts into the depiction along with the easy parts, allowing the full complexity of the person to be present in the image. The love does not require the subject to be better than they are. It does not require Homer to be smarter or more capable or more aware of his own circumstances. It does not require him to overcome the damage or resolve the grief, or figure out that the man who signs his paychecks is the man who took his mother. The love sees him as he is. The love insists on the validity of what he is, damage and all. The love says that the person produced by these circumstances and these limitations and this specific combination of wounds is a person worth depicting with full attention and full care. The show loves Marge in the same way. Loves the woman at the window, loves the patience that cost her something real, loves the capability that found an unexpected container, loves the relationship between what she could have been and what she chose to be, and does not reduce either term of that relationship to simple triumph or simple loss. The show loves Bart in the way that love looks at a child who has developed the exact defenses needed for the specific environment they are in, and sees those defenses as intelligence rather than pathology. The rebellion as rational, the refusal as dignity, the bad kid identity as a tool built for survival in a specific context, rather than as a fixed truth about who the person underneath the tool actually is. The show loves Lisa in the way that love looks at a person who keeps making the effort despite abundant evidence that the effort will not be sufficient, and recognizes in the continued effort not futility but something closer to courage. The courage of continuing to send the music out into the hallway air regardless of whether anyone comes to listen. The courage of being too much and knowing it and continuing anyway. The show loves Maggie in the way that love looks at the silent one, the one who watches everything from behind the performance of helplessness and sees what is being held behind the pacifier, sees the intelligence and the strategy and the specific kind of love that expresses itself through careful watching and careful timing and the protection of those who do not know they are being protected. The love inside the damage is what makes the show survivable. The damage is real, the system is real. The cracked cooling towers and the yellow skin and the institutional power and the episodic forgetting are all real, within the logic of the world the show has built. And inside all of that, the family is still real. The love is still real. The specific warmth of the house on Evergreen Terrace, the specific quality of the space where these particular people are together, is still real. The show has never had to choose between the honesty of the damage and the reality of the love, because the show understands with unusual clarity that these two things are not opposites. The damage is real and the love is real, and they coexist in the specific way that they always coexist in actual families, where the damage is often part of the structure that the love has to work within, and sometimes the love is the thing that makes the damage bearable, and sometimes the damage is what produced the specific quality of love that this family has, which is fierce and imperfect and sustained by something that the damage has not been able to reach. That is the inside of the show. That is what all the theories and all the social portraits and all the honest accountings of what Springfield is and what it does to its people have been circling around without quite saying directly. The love inside the damage. The family on the couch, yellow and impossible, and held together by something that the radiation, and the institutional power, and the episodic forgetting, and the floating timeline have not been able to reach. The love is the thing that the system cannot extract, cannot manage, cannot reduce to dependency or exploit into compliance. The love is the thing Burns does not have access to, for all his centuries of accumulated power, and all his medical infrastructure, and all his strategic deployment of everyone else's vulnerabilities. The love is the thing that lives in the house on Evergreen Terrace and not in the tower of the nuclear plant. And that distinction between the house and the tower, between the love and the power, is the distinction that the show has been drawing across 36 seasons, with every joke and every apology and every image of Marge at the window and Lisa in the hallway and Homer on the couch with the children he would dream about. Forever, if the coma theory is true, which it might be, because it captures something real about the nature of the dream regardless of whether it is literally accurate. Homer's heaven is his family. That is the coma theory's most honest statement. Not the Springfield Files, or the alien in the woods, or Burns glowing in the dark. Homer's heaven is the house on Evergreen Terrace, with Marge upstairs and the kids somewhere in the house and the television on and the beer cold and the door ready to open when he comes home. That is the love inside the damage. That is the whole show. And it has been there every episode, every Sunday, for 36 years. In the yellow and the cracked towers, and the fog, and the hallway music, and the window image, and the couch gag, and underneath all of it, sustaining all of it, the love that the system could not reach. They are always there. That is the whole point. That is the whole show. That is why it was never a comedy. That is why it was always something more. Number. Section 33. The inheritance we did not choose. Nobody chooses to be born in Springfield. Nobody chooses the yellow skin or the water that comes out of the tap or the specific quality of air that sits over the town on still days. Nobody chooses the economic structure that makes the nuclear plant the primary employer or the specific configuration of institutional power that makes challenging that structure a practical impossibility. Nobody chooses to be a child in a household shaped by the mother who had to leave, and the father who has been managing the fog, and the grandmother who settled into the role that circumstances assigned her before she had the vocabulary to name what the settling was costing. The inheritance is what you are born into before you have the capacity to evaluate it. Before you have the words for what the yellow skin means, or the vocabulary to question whether the fish are supposed to have 3 eyes, or the framework to understand that the cooling towers you can see from the school playground are cracked in ways that have been cracked for decades without anyone being held accountable for the cracking. The inheritance arrives before you have any way to receive it critically. Bart received his inheritance as the bad kid. Not because he was bad, because the label was available and useful, and because accepting the label meant not having to argue against the system's assessment of him in a context where the argument would exhaust him without changing the assessment. The label was a practical decision. The inheritance, received and then managed through the label, is what Bart carries through every episode of the show, in the skateboard and the slingshot and the pranks, and the loyalty he extends to Milhouse and the love he has for his family, that the bad kid label was never designed to accommodate, but that exists regardless of the label. Lisa received her inheritance as the smart one, which sounds like a kinder inheritance than the one Bart received, but which carries its own specific costs that the show has been honest about from the beginning. The smart one in a community that does not know what to do with smart is not a comfortable position. The smart one in a family where the smart one's specific gifts do not map onto the specific shape of what the family can receive is not a comfortable position. The inheritance of exceptional intelligence in Springfield is the inheritance of a tool that does not fit the available applications, and the question of what you do with a tool that does not fit has been Lisa's central question across 36 years. Maggie received her inheritance as the silent one, which is to say she received the inheritance and then decided what to do about it, which is to say she chose silence as her response, rather than having silence assigned to her as her label. In this distinction, Maggie is the most autonomous member of the Simpson family. The others received their inheritances and then managed them through the identities the management produced. Maggie received her inheritance and then chose, with full awareness of the available options, the identity that gave her the most freedom within the constraints the inheritance imposed. The inheritance is not only burden, the inheritance is also the family, also the house, also the specific quality of love that the house contains and that the family produces in their specific configuration, and that has been sustaining each of them in their different ways through the specific difficulties their individual inheritances have created. The love is part of the inheritance too. The love is what Bart and Lisa and Maggie received from Homer and Marge alongside everything else. And what they received, the love that is real even when everything else is damaged, is what makes the whole inheritance survivable. The show's portrait of inheritance is one of its most accurate and most compassionate achievements. It shows you the damage passing between generations without reducing the damage to a simple causal chain and without suggesting that the people doing the inheriting are defined by what they inherited. Homer inherited the consequences of Mona's exile and Abe's deal and Burns's decades of strategic management of the specific vulnerabilities of the Simpson family. Homer is more than those inheritances. He is the person those inheritances produced in combination with everything else he is. And the person those inheritances produced is funny and warm and incapable of sustained cruelty and genuinely in love with his family in a way that no amount of radiation or institutional damage or cognitive limitation has been able to diminish. That is the inheritance. All of it together. The damage and the love and the fog and the warmth and the yellow skin and the specific quality of Sunday evening on Evergreen Terrace that has been rendering itself in the opening credits of every episode for 36 years. Nobody chose it. And the choosing is not the point. The point is what you do with what you are given, what you build inside the constraints, what you find in the love that the damage could not reach, what you make of the hallway when the classroom door closes and the music is still in your hands and the corridor is empty and the option of continuing exists regardless of the reception. The show has been saying this across 36 years, to everyone who was willing to listen past the comedy, to everyone who was willing to sit with the apology after the joke, to everyone who recognized the yellow skin and knew that recognition was the beginning of something rather than the end. The inheritance continues. Springfield is still there. The family is still on the couch. The music is still in the hallway. And whatever you have inherited, whatever specific combination of damage and love you are carrying, from wherever you came from into whatever comes next, the show has been there with it, holding the weight of it alongside you every Sunday for 36 years. That is what it was always doing. That is what it was always for. And so after everything, will you? Number, final note. The yellow skin, the cracked towers, the floating timeline, the fog in Homer's brain and the music in Lisa's hallway, and the silence behind Maggie's pacifier, and Marge at the window in the specific quality of between-moment attention that the show holds for her with such care. The deal Abe made, the mother who left and then came back and then left again, and then died in a scene that the show played without a joke. The billionaire in the tower, who has been in the tower for over a century, and who cannot remember the name of the man who has worked for him for decades, and who glows in the dark on the nights when the weekly treatment walks him home through the woods. Burns and Homer. The tower and the couch. The man who engineered the system and the man the system was engineered to contain. Both of them yellow. Both of them Springfields. Both of them, in the end, part of the same portrait of the same place at the same time, drawn over and over for 36 years, in a color that was always meant to mean something, even when no one was sure exactly what. The cooling towers, the saxophone in the hallway, the family on the couch. Not answers. The show does not deal in answers. It deals in accumulation and in honest attention and in the specific kind of love that comes from depicting real people in real circumstances with full care and without the protective distance of either sentimentality or cynicism. It was never a comedy. It was always something that comedies, when they are made by the right people and sustained long enough, have the capacity to become a document, an honest portrait of specific people in a specific place at a specific time, made with enough skill and enough love that the specificity dissolves into something recognizable to everyone. Something that makes you look at the yellow family on the couch and think, that is not their family. That is every family. That is the specific quality of love and damage and resilience, and the credits rolling and everything going back to normal and starting again. That is the whole show. That is the whole point. Good night. Springfield will be there in the morning.